Once Delana was sure that her noxious seed had taken root, she murmured that it might be best if they were not seen arriving back at the camp together, and slipped away, pushing her mare to a quick trot through the snow, and leaving the rest of them to ride on in uneasy silence, except for the crunch of the horses' hooves. The warders maintained their distance behind, and the escorting soldiers had their attention back on the farms and thickets, without so much as a glance toward the Aes Sedai that Egwene could see now. Men never knew when to keep their mouths shut, though. Telling a man to be quiet only made him gossip all the harder, just close friends he could trust, to be sure, as if they in turn would not tell everyone who would listen. The warders might be different. Aes Sedai always insisted they were, those who had warders, but no doubt the soldiers would talk of sisters arguing, and no doubt they would say Delana had been sent off with a flea in her ear. The woman had planned this very carefully. Worse than fireweed or strangler vine could grow if that seed was allowed to sprout, but the gray sitter had sheltered herself from blame very neatly. Truth almost always did come out in the end, but by the end truth was often so wrapped around with rumors and speculation and absolute lies that most people never did believe it. I trust I don't have to ask whether any of you had heard about this before. Egwene said that quite casually, seemingly studying the countryside as they rode, but she was pleased when everyone denied it outright with considerable indignation, including Bayanin, who was working her jaw and glaring at Morven. Egwene trusted them as far as she dared. They could not have given her their oaths without meaning to hold to every word, not unless they were Black Aja, a niggling possibility that accounted for most of her caution. Yet even oaths of fealty left room for the most loyal people doing the worst possible thing in the belief that it was in your best interest. And people who had been coerced into their oaths could be adept at spotting the gaps and leeways. The real question, she continued, is what was Delana after? She had no need to explain, not for these women, every one experienced in the game of houses. If all Delana had wanted was to stop negotiations with Elida while keeping her own name out of it, she could simply have spoken to Egwene alone at any time. Sitters needed no excuse to come to the Amaran's study. Or she could have used Talima, who slept on a pallet in Egwene's tent most nights, despite being Delana's secretary. Egwene was troubled with headaches, and some nights only Halima's massages could soothe them so she could sleep. For that matter, an anonymous note might have been sufficient to make her present the hall with an edict forbidding negotiations. The touchiest quibbler would have to admit that talks to end the war certainly touched on the war. But plainly, Delana wanted Shiriam and the others to know too. Her tale-bearing was an arrow aimed at another target. Strife between the Aja heads and the sitters, Carlenio said, as cool as the snow. Perhaps strife between the Ajas. Casually adjusting her cloak, intricately embroidered white on white, but lined with dense black fur, she might have been discussing the price of a spool of thread. Why she wants these things I can't begin to say, but those will be the results, unless we are very careful, and she could not know we would be careful, or that we have any reason to be, so logically one or both must be her aim. The first answer that comes to mind isn't always correct, Carlinda, Morbrain said. There's no saying that Delana thought her actions through as carefully as you have, or that she thought along the same lines. The stout Brown believed more in common sense than logic, or so she said, but in truth she seemed to blend the two, a combination that made her very hard-headed and suspicious of quick or easy answers, which was not a bad thing to be. Delana may be trying to sway some among the sitters on some issue that's important to her. Maybe she hopes to get Elida declared Black Aja after all. No matter the results, her goal may be something we don't even suspect. Sitters can be as petty as anyone else. For all we know, she might have a grudge against one of those she named dating back to when she was a novice and they taught her. Better to concentrate on what will come of it than to worry about why until we know more. Her tone was as placid as her broad face, But Carlinia's cool composure flickered to cool disdain for a moment. Her rationality made few concessions for human foibles, or for anyone disagreeing with her. Anaya laughed, a sound of almost motherly amusement that made her bay dance a few steps before she reined him back to a walk. A motherly farm wife, amused by the antics of others in the village. Even some sisters were foolish enough to dismiss her that easily. Don't sulk, Carlinia. You are very probably right. No, Morven, she probably is. In any event, I believe we can squash any hopes she has for discord. That did not sound amused at all. No Blue was amused by anything that might hamper pulling Elida down. Mirel gave a savage nod of agreement, then blinked in surprise when Misal said, "Can you afford to stop this, Mother?" The tiny yellow did not speak out often. "I don't mean whatever Delana is trying to do. If we can settle on what that is," she added quickly, making a gesture at Morven, who had opened her mouth again. Misal looked a child alongside the other women, but it was a peremptory gesture. She was yellow, after all, with all the self-assurance that implied, and unwilling to step back for anyone in most circumstances. "I mean, the talk with Parley with the sitters in the tower." For a moment, everyone gaped at her, even Bayonet. "And why would we want to allow that?" Anaya said, finally, in a dangerous voice. "We didn't come all this way to talk to Elida." She was a farm wife with a cleaver hidden behind her back and a mind to use it now. Nisao looked up at her and sniffed dismissively. "I didn't say we wanted it. I asked whether we dare stop it." "I hardly see the difference." Chirion's voice was icy and her face pale. With anger, Egwene thought, but it might have been fear. "Then think for a while and you might see it," Misal said dryly. Dry the way a knife blade was dry, and equally cutting. "At present, talk of negotiations is limited to 5 sitters and very quiet. But will it remain so? Once word spreads that talks were proposed and rejected, how long before despair sets in? No, hear me out. We all set off full of righteous fury for justice. Yet here we sit, staring at the walls of Tar Valon, while Elida sits in the tower. We've been here nearly 2 weeks, and for all anyone can see, we may be here 2 years or 20. The longer we sit with nothing happening, the more sisters will start making excuses for Elida's plans. The more they'll start thinking that we have to mend the tower, never mind the cost. Do you want to wait until sisters start giving back to Elida one by one? I myself do not fancy standing on the riverbank defying the woman with just the blue Aja and the rest of you for company. Negotiations will at least let everyone see that something is happening." "No one is going to return to Elida," Anaya protested, shifting on her saddle.
No shit.
But she wore a troubled frown, and she sounded as if she could see
Still
it
gotta
happening.
do that, huh?
The tower beckoned to every Aes Sedai. Very likely even Black sisters yearned for the tower to be whole again. And there it stood, just a few miles away, but seemingly out of reach. "Talk could buy time, Mother," Morven said reluctantly, and no one could put as much reluctance in her voice as she. Her frown was thoughtful and not pleased. "A few more weeks, and Lord Gareth might be able to find the ships he needs to block the harbors. That will alter everything in our favor.
Roll my couple,
With no
couple
way for
joints
food
up
to
here.
get in or mouths
We'll
to
do
get
it down
out,
too.
the city will be starving inside a month." Egwene hung on to a smooth face with an effort. There was no real hope of ships to block the harbor, though none of them knew that. Gareth had made it plain enough to her, however, long before leaving Murandy. Originally, he had hoped to buy vessels while they marched north along the Aranon, using them to ferry supplies until they reached Tar Valon, then sinking them in the harbor mouths. Using gateways to reach Tar Valon had put paid to that in more ways than one. Word of the siege had left the city with the first ships sailing after the army arrived, and now, as far north and south as he had sent riders, Ship captains were carrying out their business ashore by boat, from anchorages well out in the river. No captain was willing to risk the chance her ship would simply be seized. Gareth made his reports only to her, and his officers only to him, yet any sister could have known if she talked with a few soldiers. Fortunately, even sisters looking for warders rarely spoke to soldiers. They were generally accounted a thieving, unlettered lot who only bathed by accident when they had to wade a stream. Not the kind of man any sisters spent time with except when compelled to. It made keeping secrets easier, and some secrets were essential, including, sometimes, secrets kept from those seemingly on your side. She could remember not thinking that way, but that was a part of the innkeeper's daughter she had been obliged to leave behind. This was another world, with very different rules from Emmons Field. A misstep there meant a summons to the women's circle. Here, a misstep meant death or worse, and for more than herself. The sitters remaining in the tower should be willing to talk, Carlinia put in with a sigh. They have to know that the longer the siege lasts, the more chance Lord Gareth will find his ships. I cannot think how long they will continue talking, though, when they realize we do not mean to surrender. Elida will insist on that, Mirelle muttered, yet she did not seem to be arguing, just talking to herself, and Shiriam shivered, drawing her cloak around her as though she had let the cold touch her. Only Bayanin looked happy, sitting eager and upright in her saddle, dark honey hair framing a wide smile inside her hood. She did not press her case, however. She was good at negotiation, so everyone said, and knew when to wait. I did say you could begin, Egwene said. Not that she had meant it for more than a set-down. Yet if you were going to live by the 3 oaths, then you had to stand by what you said. She could not wait to hold the oath rod. It would be so much easier then. Just make sure you're very careful what you say. Unless they think we all grew wings to fly here, they must suspect we've rediscovered traveling, but they can't be certain unless someone confirms it. It's better for us if they stay uncertain. That must be one secret you hold as tightly as you hold the secret of our ferrets in the tower. Mirelle and Anaya jerked at that, and Carlinia looked around as though fearful, though neither warders nor soldiers were close enough to hear unless someone shouted. Morvrin merely took on an even more sour expression. Even Nisau looked a little ill, though she had had nothing to do with the decision to send sisters back to the tower in secret, supposedly answering Elida's summons. The hall might be happy to learn that 10 sisters were in the tower trying to undermine Elida however they could, even if the effort had borne no apparent fruit so far. But the sitters would most definitely be unhappy at realizing that it had been kept secret because these women feared that some of the sitters might actually be Black Aja. As well for Shiriam and the others to reveal their oaths to Egwene as reveal that. The results for them might not be very different. The hall had not ordered anyone birched yet, but the way most sitters chafed at the bit over Egwene's control of the war, it could hardly come as a surprise if they jumped at the chance to show they still had some authority, while simultaneously expressing their displeasure forcefully. Bayanin was apparently the only one who had opposed that decision, at least until it became apparent the others were going ahead anyway. But she drew a shuddering breath, too, and a tightness settled around her eyes. In her case, the sudden realization of just what she had undertaken might have played its part, too. Just finding someone in the tower who was willing to talk might prove a daunting task. Eyes and ears inside Tar Valon could offer only hearsay about events inside the tower. News of the tower itself came only in dribs and drabs, from sisters venturing into Tel Riod to glimpse fleeting reflections of the waking world. But every last one of those scraps told of Elida ruling by edict and caprice, with not even the hall daring to stand against her. Bayanin's face took on a grayish tinge, till she began to appear more sickly than Nisau. Anaya and the others looked as bleak as death. A wave of gloom rose in Egwene. These were among the strongest against Elida, even the foot-dragging Bayanin, who always wanted to talk rather than act. Well, Greys were noted for believing that anything could be solved with enough talk. They should try that on a Trolloc sometime, or just a footpad, and see how far they got. Without Shiriam and the rest, resistance to Elida would have fallen apart before it ever had a chance to coalesce. It nearly had anyway. But Elida was as firmly seated in the tower as ever, and after all they had gone through, all they had done, it seemed that even Anaya saw it all melting away into disaster. No! Drawing a deep breath, Egwene straightened her shoulders and sat erect in her saddle. She was the lawful Amerlin, no matter what the Hall had thought they were getting when they raised her, and she had to keep the rebellion against Elida alive to have any hope of healing the tower. If that required a pretense of negotiations, it would not be the first time Aes Sedai had pretended to aim at one thing while targeting another. Whatever was required to keep the rebellion alive and pull Elida down, she would do. Whatever was required. Stretch the talks out as long as you can, she told Bayanin. You can talk about anything so long as you keep the secrets that need keeping. But agree to nothing and keep them talking. Swaying in her saddle, the Grey definitely looked sicker than Anaya. She almost appeared ready to empty her stomach. When the camp came into sight, with the sun nearly halfway to its noonday peak, the escort of lightly armored horsemen broke away back toward the river, leaving Egwene and the sisters to ride the last mile across the snow, followed by the warders. Lord Gareth paused as if he wanted to speak with her once more, but finally he turned his bay east after the cavalry, trotting to catch up as they vanished beyond the long coppiced stand of trees. He would not bring up their disagreement or their discussions where anyone else could hear, and he believed that Bayanin and the others were just what everyone else thought them, the Ajah's watchdogs. She felt a little sad at holding things back from him, but the fewer who knew a secret, the more likely it would remain secret. The camp was a sprawl of tents in every shape and size and color and state of repair that almost covered a broad tree-rimmed pasture, halfway between Tar Valon and Dragon Mount, inside a ring of horse lines and rows of wagons and carts in almost as many shapes as there were wagons and carts. Chimney smoke rose in several places a few miles beyond the tree line, but the local farmers stayed away except for selling eggs and milk and butter, or sometimes when one needed healing from some accident. And there was no sign at all of the army Egwene had brought so far. Gareth had concentrated his forces along the river, part occupying the bridge towns on both banks, and the rest in what he called reserve camps, placed where men could be rushed to help fight off any sortie in strength from the city, just in case he was wrong about High Captain Chube. Always consider the possibility your assumptions are wrong, he had told her. No one objected to his placements, of course, not in general anyway. Any number of sisters were ready to nitpick the details, but holding the bridge towns was the only way to besiege Tar Valon, after all. By land it was. And a good many Aes Sedai were pleased to have the soldiers out of sight, if not out of mind. 3 warders in color-shifting cloaks came riding out from the camp as Egwene and the others approached, one of them very tall and one quite short, so they seemed arranged in steps. Making their bows to Egwene and the sisters, nodding to the warders behind, they all had that dangerous look of men so confident that they had no need to convince anyone how dangerous they were, which somehow made it all the more evident. A warder at his ease and a lion resting on a hill, so went an old saying among Aes Sedai. The rest of it was lost in the years, but there really was no need to say more. The sisters were not entirely complacent about the safety of even a camp full of Aes Sedai under the circumstances. Warders patrolled closely for miles in every direction, lions on the prowl. Anaya and the others, all but Shiriam, scattered as soon as they reached the first row of tents beyond the wagons. Each would be seeking out the head of her Ajah, ostensibly to report on Egwene's ride to the river with Lord Gareth, and, more importantly, to make sure those Aja heads knew that some of the sitters were talking about negotiations with Elida, and that Egwene was being firm. It would have been easier if she knew who those women were, but even oaths of fealty did not stretch to revealing that. Mirelle had nearly swallowed her tongue when Egwene suggested it. Being dropped into a job without training was hardly the best way to learn it, and Egwene knew she had oceans to learn yet about being Amyrlin. Oceans to learn and a job of work to do at the same time. "If you will forgive me, Mother," Shiriam said, when Bayanin, the last to go, vanished among the tents, trailed by her scar-faced warder. "I have a writing table piled high with paper." The lack of enthusiasm in her voice was understandable. The keeper's stole came along with ever-growing stacks of reports to be sorted and documents to be prepared. Despite her zeal for the rest of the job, which in this case was to keep the camp running, Shiriam had been heard to mutter fervent wishes, when confronted by yet another mound of papers, that she was still mistress of novices. Still, as soon as Egwene gave permission, she booted her black-footed dapple to a trot, scattering a covey of workmen in rough coats and mufflers wrapped around their heads, who were carrying large baskets on their backs. One fell flat on his face in the half-frozen muck that passed for a street. Shiriam's Arinvar, a slim Carianan with graying temples, paused long enough to make sure the fellow was getting to his feet, then spurred his dark bay stallion after her, leaving the workmen to his curses, most of which seemed to be directed at his companion's laughter. Everyone knew that when an Aes Sedai wanted to go somewhere, he got out of the way. What had spilled out of the fellow's basket onto the street caught Egwene's eye and made her shiver. A tall heap of meal, crawling with weevils, till it seemed there were as many moving black specks as meal. The men must all have been carrying ruined meal to the midden heaps. There was no use bothering to sift anything that infested. Only someone who was starving could eat it. But too many baskets of meal and grain had to be disposed of every day. For that matter, half the barrels of salt pork and salt beef opened for use stank so that there was nothing to be done except bury them. For the servants and workmen, at least those who had experience of camp life, that was nothing new. A little worse than usual, but not unheard of. Weevils could appear any time, and merchants trying to stretch their profits always sold some rotting meat along with the good. Among the Aes Sedai, though, it was cause for deep worry. Every barrel of meat, every sack of grain or flour or meal had been surrounded by a keeping as soon as bought, and whatever was woven into a keeping could not change until the weave was removed. But still the meat rotted and the insects multiplied. It was though Sidar itself was failing. You could get a sister to make jokes about the Black Aja before you could get her to talk about that. One of the laughing men caught sight of Egwene watching them, and nudged the mud-covered fellow, who moderated his language, though not very far. He even glowered as if blaming her for his fall. With her face half hidden by her hood, and the Amyrlin stole folded in her belt pouch, they seemed to take her for one of the accepted, not all of whom had enough proper clothing to always dress as they should, or perhaps a visitor. Women frequently slipped into the camp, often keeping their faces hidden in public until they left again, whether they wore fine silks or threadbare wool, and showing a sour expression to a stranger or an accepted was certainly safer than grimacing at an Aes Sedai. It seemed odd not to have everyone in sight bobbing and bowing. She had been in the saddle since before first light, and if a hot bath was out of the question, water had to be carried in from the wells that had been dug half a mile west of the camp, which made all but the most fastidious or self-absorbed sisters limit themselves. If a long, hot soak was not to be had, she still would have liked to put her feet back on the ground, or better yet, put them up on a footstool. Besides, refusing to let the cold touch you was not at all the same as warming your hands at a toasty brazier. Her own writing table would have its pile of paper, too. Last night she had told Shiriam to give her the reports on the state of wagon repairs and the supply of fodder for the horses. They would be dry and boring, but she checked on different areas every day, so she could at least tell whether what people told her was based on fact or wishes. And there were always the eyes and ears reports. What the Ajas decided to pass along to the Amalin's seat made for fascinating reading when compared to what Swan and Liana gave her from their agents. It was not so much that there were contradictions, yet what the Ajas chose to keep to themselves could draw interesting pictures. Comfort and duty both pulled her toward her study. Just another tent, really, though everyone called it the Amalin's study. But this was an opportunity to look around without having everything hastily made ready ahead of her arrival. Pulling her hood a little further forward to better conceal her face, she touched her heels lightly to Daishar's flanks. There were few people mounted, mostly warders, though the infrequent groom added to the traffic, leading a horse at as close to a trot as could be managed in the ankle-deep slush. But no one seemed to recognize her or her mount. In contrast to the nearly empty streets, the wooden walkways, no more than rough planks pegged atop sawn logs, shifted slightly under the weight of people. The handful of men, dotting the streams of women like raisins in a cheap cake, walked twice as fast as anyone else. Excepting warders, men got their business among Aes Sedai done as quickly as possible. Nearly all the women had their faces hidden, their breath misting in the openings of their hoods, yet it was easy to pick out Aes Sedai from visitors, whether their cloaks were plain or embroidered and lined with fur. The crowds parted in front of a sister. Anyone else had to weave her way through. Not that many sisters were about on this frigid mid-morning. Most would be snug in their tents. Alone in twos or threes, they would be reading or writing letters, or questioning their visitors about whatever information those women had brought, which might or might not be shared with the rest of the sisters Aja, much less with anyone else. The world saw Aes Sedai as a monolith, towering and solid, or it had before the current division in the tower became common knowledge. Yet the pure fact was that the Ajas stood apart in all but name, the hall their only true meeting point, and the sisters themselves were little more than a convocation of hermits, speaking 3 words beyond what was absolutely required only with a few friends, or with another sister they had joined in some design. Whatever else changed about the tower, Egwene was sure that never would. There was no point pretending that Aes Sedai had ever been anything but Aes Sedai, or ever would be. A great river rolling onward, all its powerful currents hidden deep, altering its course with imperceptible slowness. She had built a few hasty dams in that river, diverting a stream here and a stream there for her own purposes, yet she knew they were temporary structures. Sooner or later those deep currents would undercut her dams. She could only pray they lasted long enough. Pray and shore up as hard as she could. Very occasionally, one of the accepted appeared in the throng, with the 7 bands of color on the hood of her white cloak, but most by far were novices in unadorned white wool. Only a handful of the 21 accepted in the camp actually possessed banded cloaks, and they saved their few banded dresses for teaching classes or attending sisters. Yet great efforts had been made to see that every novice was dressed in white at all times, even if she only had one change. The accepted inevitably tried to move with the swan-like glide of Aes Sedai, and 1 or 2 nearly managed, despite the tilting of the walkways underfoot. But the novices darted along almost as quickly as the few men, scurrying on errands, or hurrying to classes in groups of 6 or 7. Aes Sedai had not had so many novices to teach in a very long time, not since before the Trolloc Wars, when there had been many more Aes Sedai as well. And the result of finding themselves with near 1,000 students had been utter confusion until they were organized into these families. The name was not strictly official, yet it was used even by Aes Sedai, who still disliked taking any woman who asked. Now every novice knew where she was supposed to be and when, and every sister could at least find out. Not to mention that the number of runaways had declined. That was always a concern for Aes Sedai, and several hundred of these women might well attain the shawl. No sister wanted to lose one of it, or any for that matter, not before the decision was made to send a woman away. Women still slipped off occasionally after realizing that the training was harder than they had expected, and the road to an Aes Sedai's shawl longer. But quite apart from the families making it easier to keep track, running away seemed to be less attractive to women who had 5 or 6 cousins, as they were called, to lean on. Well short of the big square pavilion that served as the hall of the tower, she turned Daishar down a side street. The walkway in front of the pale brown canvas pavilion was empty. The hall was not a place anyone approached at business there, but the much-patched side curtains were kept down without a reason to make the workings of the hall public, so there was no telling who might step out. Any sitter would recognize Daishar at a glance, and some sitters she would as soon avoid even more than others. Lelaine and Ramonda, for example, who resisted her authority as instinctively as they opposed each other, or any of those who had begun talking of negotiations. It was too much to believe that they were just hoping to rally spirits, or they would not have kept to whispers. The courtesies had to be maintained, though, no matter how often she wished she could box someone's ears. Yet no one could think she was being snubbed if Egwene did not see her. A faint silvery light flashed behind a tall canvas wall just ahead of her, surrounding one of the camp's 2 traveling grounds, and a moment later 2 sisters emerged from behind one of the flaps. Neither Freydrine nor Shamari was strong enough to weave a gateway by herself, but linked, she thought they could just manage one big enough to walk through. Heads close together in deep conversation, strangely, they were just pinning on their cloaks. Egwene kept her face averted anyway as she rode by. Both of the Browns had taught her as a novice, and Freydrine still seemed surprised that Egwene was Amyrlin. Lean as a heron, she was quite capable of wading out into the muck to ask whether Egwene needed assistance. Shamari, a vigorous, square-faced woman who looked more like a green than a librarian, was always beyond proper in her behavior, much beyond. Her deep curtsies, suitable for a novice, carried at least a suggestion of mockery, no matter how smooth her expression, not least because she had been known to curtsy when she saw Egwene 100 paces away. Where had they been, she wondered? Somewhere indoors, perhaps, or at least warmer than the camp. No one really kept track of the sisters' comings and goings, of course, not even the Ajahs. Custom ruled everyone, and custom strongly discouraged direct questions about what a sister was doing or where she was going. Most likely, Freydrine and Shamari had been to hear from some of their eyes and ears face to face, or maybe to look at a book in some library. They were brown, but she could not help thinking of Nisau's comment about sisters slipping away to Elida. It was quite possible to hire a boatman to make the crossing to the city, where dozens of tiny water gates gave entrance to anyone who wished it. But with a gateway, there was no need to risk exposure by riding to the river and asking after boats. Just one sister returning to the tower with the knowledge of that weed would give away their largest advantage, and there was no way to stop it, except to keep heart in the opposition to Elida, except to make the sisters believe there could be a quick end to this, if only there was a way to a quick end. Not far beyond the traveling ground, Egwene drew rein and frowned at a long wall tent, even more patched than the hall. An Aes Sedai came swanning down the walkway. She wore a plain dark blue cloak, and the cowl hid her face, but novices and others skipped out of her way as they never would have for a merchant, say, and paused in front of the tent, looking at it for a long moment before pushing aside the entry flap to go inside, her unwillingness as clear as if she had shouted. Egwene had never gone in there. She could feel Saidar being channeled inside, though faintly. The amount necessary was surprisingly small. A quick visit from the Amyrlin should not draw too much attention, however. She very much wanted to see what she had set in motion. Dismounting in front of the tent, though, she discovered a trifling difficulty. There was nowhere to tie Daishar. The Amerlin always had someone rushing to hold her stirrup and take away her horse, but she stood there holding the gelding's reins, and clusters of novices bustled past with no more than a quick glance, dismissing her as one of the visitors. By this time every novice knew all of the accepted on sight, but few had seen the Amerlin's seat close up. She did not even have the ageless face to tell them she was Aes Sedai. With a rueful laugh, she put a gloved hand into her belt pouch. The stole would tell them who she was, and then she could order one of them to hold her horse for a few minutes, unless they thought it was a joke in bad taste at least. Some of the novices from Emond's Field had tried to pull the stole from her neck to keep her from getting in trouble. No, that was past and dealt with. Abruptly, the entry flap was pushed open, and Lyanna emerged, fastening her dark green cloak with a silver pin in the shape of a fish. The cloak was silk, and richly embroidered in silver and gold, as was the bodice of her riding dress. Her red gloves were embroidered on the backs, too. Lyanna paid minute attention to her clothes since joining the Green Aja. Her eyes widened lightly at the sight of Egwene, but her coppery face smoothed immediately. Taking in the situation at a glance, she put out a hand to stop a novice who appeared to be by herself. Novices went to classes by family. "What's your name, child?" Much had changed about Lyanna, but not her briskness, except when she wanted it to, anyway. Most men turned to putty when Lyanna's voice grew languorous, but she never wasted that on women. "Are you on an errand for a sister?" The novice, a pale-eyed woman close to her middle years, with an unblemished skin that had never seen a day's work in the field, gaped openly before recovering enough to make her curtsy, a smoothly practiced spreading of her white skirts with mittened hands. As tall as most men, but willowy and graceful and beautiful, Lyanna lacked the ageless look, too, yet hers was one of the two most well-known faces in the camp. Novices pointed her out in awe, a sister who had once been keeper, who had been stilled and healed so she could channel again, if not so strongly as before. And then she had changed Ajas. The newest women in white already had learned that that just never happened, though the other was becoming a part of lore, unfortunately. It was harder to make a novice go slowly when you could not point out that she risked ending her quest for the shawl by burning herself out and losing the one power forever. "Let us Muro, Aes Sedai," the woman said respectfully in a lilting Murandian accent. She sounded as if she wanted to say more, perhaps to give a title, but one of the first lessons on joining the tower was that you had left behind who you used to be. It was a hard lesson for some, especially those who possessed titles. "I'm going to visit my sister. I haven't seen her more than a minute since before we left Murundi." Relatives were always put in different novice families, as were women who had known each other before being entered in the novice book. It encouraged making new friends, and cut down on the inevitable tensions when one was learning faster than the other, or had a higher potential. "She's free of classes, too, until the afternoon, and—" "Your sister will have to wait a while longer, child," Lyanna broke in. "Hold the Amerlin's horse for her." Lettuce gave a start and stared at Egwene, who had finally managed to extract her stole. Handing Daishar's reins to the woman, she lowered her cowl and settled the long, narrow strip of cloth onto her shoulders. Light as a feather in her pouch, the stole had real weight hanging around her neck. Swan claimed that sometimes you could feel every woman who had ever worn the stole hanging from the ends of it, a constant reminder of responsibility and duty, and Egwene believed every word. The Murandian gaped at her harder than she had for Lyanna, and took longer to remember to curtsy. No doubt she had heard that the Amerlin was young, but it seemed unlikely she had given a thought to how young. "Thank you, child," Egwene said smoothly. There had been a time when she felt strange calling a woman 10 years older than herself child. Everything changed with time. "It won't be for long. Lyanna, would you ask someone to send a groom for Daisha? Now that I'm out of the saddle, I'd as soon stay out, and Lettuce should be allowed to see her sister." "I will see to it myself, Mother." Liana offered a fluid curtsy and moved away with never a hint that there was more between them than this chance encounter. Egwene trusted her far more than she did Anaya or even Shiriam. She certainly kept no secrets from Liana, any more than from Swan. But their friendship was yet another secret that had to be kept. For one thing, Liana had eyes and ears actually inside Tar Valon, if not in the tower itself, and their reports came to Egwene and Egwene alone. For another, Liana was much petted for accommodating so well to her reduced status, and every sister welcomed her, if only because she was living proof that stilling, the deepest dread of any Aes Sedai, could be reversed. They welcomed her with open arms, and because she was less now, standing below at least half the sisters in the camp, they often spoke in front of her about matters they would never want the Amyrlin to know of. So Egwene did not so much as glance after her as she left. Instead, she offered Lettuce a smile. The woman reddened and bobbed another curtsy, then entered the tent, stripping off her gloves and tucking them behind her belt. Inside, 8 mirrored stand lamps stood along the walls between low wooden chests. One with a bit of worn gilding and the rest of painted iron. No 2 of the lamps had the same number of arms, but they provided good illumination, if not so bright as outside. Assorted tables that seemed to have come from 7 different farm kitchens made a row down the center of the canvas ground cloth. The benches of the 3 farthest occupied by a half a dozen novices with their cloaks folded beside them, each woman surrounded by the glow of the power. Tiana, the mistress of novices, hovered anxiously over them, walking between the tables, and surprisingly, so did Sharina Malloy, one of the novices acquired in Mirandy. Well, Sharina was not exactly hovering, just watching calmly, and perhaps it should not have been a surprise to find her there. A dignified, gray-haired grandmother with a tight bun on the back of her head, Sharina had run a very large family with a very firm hand, and she seemed to have adopted all of the other novices as granddaughters or grandnieces. She was the one who had organized them into those tiny families, completely on her own, and apparently out of simple disgust at seeing everyone flounder around. Most Aes Sedai went more than a touch tight-mouthed if reminded of that, though they had accepted the form quickly enough once they realized how much easier it made keeping track and organizing classes. Tiana was inspecting the novices' work so closely that it seemed obvious she was attempting to ignore Sharina's presence. Short and slight, with large brown eyes and a dimple in her cheek, Tiana somehow looked young despite her ageless face, particularly alongside the taller novices' creased cheeks and broad hips. The pair of Aes Sedai channeling at the table nearest the entrance, Chiron and Ashmanila, had an audience of 2 as well. Janya Frenda, a sitter for the brown, and Salita Toranis, a sitter for the yellow. The Aes Sedai and the novices were all performing the same task. In front of each woman, a close net, woven of earth, fire, and air, surrounded a small bowl or cup or the like, all made by the camp's blacksmiths, who were very puzzled at why the sisters wanted such things made of iron, not to mention having them made as finely as if they were silver. A second weave, earth and fire woven just so, penetrated each net to touch the object, which was slowly turning white. Very, very slowly in every case. Ability with the weave improved with practice, but of the 5 powers, strength in earth was the key, and beside Egwene herself, only 9 sisters in the camp, along with 2 of the accepted and nearly 24 novices, had sufficient of that to make the weaves work at all. Few among the sisters wanted to give any time to it, though. Ashmanila, lean enough to make her seem taller than she really was, fingers tapping the tabletop on either side of the simple metal cup in front of her, was frowning impatiently as the edge of whiteness crept upward past halfway. Chiron's blue eyes were cold enough that it seemed her stare alone might shatter the tall goblet she was working on. That had only the smallest rim of white at the bottom. It must have been Chiron Egwene had seen going in. Not everyone was unenthusiastic, though. Janya, slim in her pale bronze silks and wearing her brown-fringed shawl draped over her arms, studied what Chiron and Ashmanila were doing with the eagerness of one who wished she could be doing the same. Janya wanted to know everything, to know how everything was done and why it happened that way. She had been extremely disappointed when she could not learn to make turangrial. Only 3 sisters aside from Elaine had managed that so far, with very spotty success, and she had made a concerted effort to learn this skill, even after the testing showed she fell short of the required strength in using earth. Salita was the first to notice Egwene. Round-faced and almost as dark as charcoal, she eyed Egwene levelly, and the yellow fringe of her shawl swayed slightly as she made a very precise curtsy, exact to the inch. Raised in Salidar, Salita was part of a disturbing pattern. Too many sitters who were too young for the position. Salita had only been Aes Sedai for 35 years, and rarely was a woman given a chair before wearing the shawl for 100 or more. Swan saw a pattern anyway and thought it disturbing, though she could not say why. Patterns she could not understand always disturbed Swan. Still, Salita had stood for war against Elida and frequently supported Egwene in the hall, but not always, and not in this. "Mother," she said coolly. Janya's head jerked up and she broke into a beaming smile. She also had stood for war, the only woman who had been a sitter before the tower divided to do so, excepting Lilane and Lirella, 2 of the Blues. And if her support for Egwene was not always unwavering, it was so here. As usual, words spilled out of her. "I will never get over this, Mother. It's simply amazing. I know we shouldn't be surprised any longer when you come up with something no one else has thought of. Sometimes I think we've gotten too set in our ways, too sure what can and cannot be done. But to puzzle out how to make Gwendyar—" She paused for breath, and Salita moved into the gap smoothly and coldly. "I still say it is wrong," she said firmly. "I admit the discovery was a brilliant piece of work on your part, Mother, but Aes Sedai should not be making things for sale." Salita invested that word with all the scorn of a woman who accepted the income from her estate in Tyr without ever thinking how it had been come by. The attitude was not uncommon, though most sisters lived on the tower's generous yearly allowance, or had, before the tower split apart. On top of which, she went on, nearly half the sisters forced into this are yellow. I receive complaints every day. We, at least, have more important uses for our time than making trinkets. That earned her a hard glare from Ashmanila, a gray, and a frigid stare from Chiron, who was blue, but Salita ignored them. She was one of those yellows who seemed to think the other Ajas were only adjuncts to her own, which, of course, had the only truly useful purpose among them. "And novices should not be doing weaves of this complexity at all," Tiana added, joining them. The mistress of novices was never shy about speaking up to sitters or to the Amerlin, and she wore a disgruntled expression. She did not appear to realize that it deepened her dimple and made her look sulky. "It is a remarkable discovery, and I, for one, have no objections to trade, but some of these girls can barely manage to make a ball of fire change color with any surety. Letting them handle weaves like this will only make it more difficult to stop them from leaping to things they can't handle, and the light knows that's difficult enough already. They may even do themselves an injury." "Nonsense, nonsense," Janya exclaimed, waving a slender hand as if to brush away the very idea. "Every girl who's been chosen can already make 3 balls of fire at once, and this requires very little more of the power. There's no danger at all so long as they're under a sister's supervision, and they always are. I've seen the roster. Besides, what we make in a day will bring enough to pay the army for a week or more, but the sisters alone can't produce near that much." Squinting slightly, she suddenly appeared to be looking through Tiana.
I'll be right
The
back.
cascade from her tongue never slowed, yet she seemed to be talking at least half to herself. "We will have to take great care in the selling. The sea folk have a voracious appetite for Gwendyar, and there are plenty of their ships still at Ilion and Tyr by all accounts. The nobles there agree for it too, but even ravenous appetites have limits. I still cannot decide whether it will be best to appear with everything at once, or let it trickle out. Sooner or later, even the price of Gwendyar will begin to drop." Abruptly she blinked and peered first at Tiana, then at Salita, tilting her head to one side. "You do see my point, don't you?" Salita glowered and hitched her shawl up on her shoulders. Tiana threw up her hands in exasperation. Egwene held her peace. For once she felt no shame at being praised for one of her supposed discoveries. Unlike nearly everything else except traveling, this one actually was hers, though Mogadine had pointed the way before she escaped. The woman did not know how to actually make anything. At least she had not revealed any such knowledge, however hard Egwene had pressed her, and she had pressed very hard. But Mogadine had a wide streak of greed, and even in the age of legends, Quendiar had been a prized luxury. She had known enough of how it was made for Egwene to puzzle out the rest. In any case, no matter who objected or how strenuously, the need for money meant the production of Quendiar would continue, though as far as she was concerned, the longer before any of it was sold, the better. Sharina, clapping her hands together loudly in the back of the tent, jerked everyone's head.
Hopefully he's all right, bro.
Chiron and Ashmanila turned too, the blue even letting her weaves go till the goblet bounced on the tabletop with a metallic clatter. It was a sign of boredom. The process could be started over, though finding the precise point was very hard, and some sisters took every opportunity to do anything else during the hour they had to spend in the tent each day. An hour or until they completed one item start to finish, whichever came first. That was supposed to push them to try harder at increasing their skill, but few had progressed very far. "Vote a win, Nicola. Off to your next class," Sharina announced. She did not speak loudly, but her voice had a strength that could have cut through a babble of voices, much less the quiet of the tent. "You have just time to wash your hands and faces. Quickly now. You don't want any bad reports." Bodawin moved with efficient alacrity, releasing Saidar and placing her half-made Quendiar bracelet in one of the chests along the wall for someone else to finish, then gathering her cloak. Plump-cheeked and pretty, she wore her hair in a long, dark braid, though Egwene was not sure she had gotten permission from the women's circle. But then that world was behind her now. Tugging on her mittens as she hurried from the tent, Boda kept her eyes down and never glanced in Egwene's direction. Plainly, she still did not understand why a novice could not drop by to chat with the Amelin seat whenever she wanted, even if they had grown up together. Egwene would have loved to talk with Boda and some of the others, but an Amelin had lessons to learn too. An Amelin had many duties, few friends, and no favorites. Besides, even the appearance of favoritism would mark the Two Rivers girls out and make their lives with the other novices a misery. And it wouldn't do me much good with the hall either, she thought wryly. She did wish the Two Rivers girls understood, though. The other novice Sharina had named did not leave her bench or stop channeling. Nicola's black eyes flashed at Sharina. "I could be the best at this if I was ever allowed to really practice," she grumbled sullenly. "I'm getting better, I know I am. I can foretell, you know." As if the one had anything to do with the other. "Tiana said I tell her I can stay longer. I can finish this bowl before my next class, and I'm sure Adina said I won't mind if I'm just a little late." If her class was any time soon, she would be more than a little late if she tarried to complete the bowl. Her hour's effort had turned only half of it white. Tiana opened her mouth, but before she could utter a word, Sharina raised one finger, then a moment later, a second. It must have had some particular significance, because Nicola went pale and let go of her weaves on the instant, leaping up so quickly that she joggled the bench, earning quick frowns from the other two novices who shared it. They bent quickly back to their work, though, and Nicola almost ran to thrust the half-done bowl into a chest before snatching up her cloak. To Egwene's surprise, a woman she had not seen, dressed in a short brown coat and wide trousers, jumped up from where she had been sitting on the ground cloth beyond the tables. Scowling blue-eyed daggers at everyone in sight, Arena ran out of the tent after Nicola, the two women mirror images of disgruntlement and discontent. Seeing the pair of them together made Egwene uneasy. I didn't know friends were allowed in here to watch, she said. Is Nicola still causing problems? Nicola and Irena had attempted to blackmail her and Mirelle and Misao, but that was not what she meant. That was still another secret. Better the girl's friendly with Irena than with one of the male grooms, Tiana said with a sniff. We've had 2 get with child, you know, and 10 more likely to. The girl needs more friends, though. Friends will do the trick with her. She cut off as 2 more white-clad novices hurried into the tent, the pair of them squeaking and skidding to a halt when they found Aes Sedai standing right in front of them. Hastily dropping curtsies, they scuttled to the back of the tent at a gesture from Tiana and folded their cloaks on a bench before fetching a partly white goblet and an almost white cup from one of the chests. Sharina saw them settled to work, then gathered her own cloak and swung it around her shoulders before coming up the tent. If you will excuse me, Tiana Sedai, she said, making a curtsy that just came short of being to an equal. I've been told off to help with the midday meal today, and I wouldn't want to get crosswise with the cooks. Her dark eyes rested on Egwene for a brief moment, and she nodded to herself. Go on then, Tiana said sharply. I would hate to hear you had been switched for being late. Without turning a hair, Sharina offered her courtesies again, neither in a hurry nor dragging it out, to Tiana, to the sitters, to Egwene, with another glance that was penetrating but too short for offense, and when the tent flap swung shut behind her, Tiana blew out her cheeks in exasperation. Nicola causes less trouble than some, she said darkly, and Janya shook her head. Sharina doesn't cause problems, Tiana. She spoke as quickly as ever, but quietly, so her voice would not carry to the back of the tent. Disagreements between sisters were never aired in front of novices, especially when the disagreement was over a novice. She already knows the rules better than any accepted, and never puts a toe over the line. She never shirks at even the dirtiest chores either, and she's the first to lend a hand when another novice needs one. Sharina is simply who she is. Light. You can't allow a novice to intimidate you. Tiana stiffened and opened her mouth angrily, but once Janya had the bit between her teeth, getting a word in edgewise was no easy matter. Nicola, on the other hand, causes all sorts of problems, Mother, the Brown rushed on. Ever since we found out she has the foretelling, she's been foretelling 2 or 3 times a day to hear her tell it, or rather to hear Irena tell it. Nicola is smart enough to know everyone is aware she can't remember what she says when she foretells, but Irena always seems to be there to hear and remember and help her interpret. Some are the sort of thing anyone in the camp with half a brain and a credulous nature might think of. Battles with the Shan Chen or the Ashman, an Amerlin imprisoned, the dragon reborn doing 9 impossible things, visions that might be Tarman-Gaiden or a bilious stomach, and the rest all just happen to indicate that Nicola ought to be allowed to go faster with her lessons. She's always too greedy for that. I think even most of the other novices have stopped believing her. She also pokes her nose everywhere, Salita put in the moment Janya gave her an opening. Her and the groom both. Her face remained smooth and cool, and she shifted her shawl as though that were the focus of her attention. But she rushed her words a little, perhaps fearing that the Brown would take over again. They've both been switched for eavesdropping on sisters, and I myself caught Nicola trying to peek into one of the traveling grounds. She said she just wanted to see a gateway open, but I think she was trying to learn the weave. Impatience I can understand, but deceit cannot be tolerated. I no longer believe Nicola will attain the shawl, and frankly I've begun to wonder whether she should be sent away soon rather than late. The novice book may be open to everyone, she finished with an expressionless glance at Egwene, but we do not have to lower our standards completely. Glaring, Tiana pursed her lips stubbornly, emphasizing her dimple again. You could almost forget she had worn the shawl for over 30 years and think her a novice herself. Q-tips. As long as I am mistress of novices, the decision on whether to send a girl away is mine, she said heatedly, and I do not intend to lose a girl of Nicola's potential. Nicola would be very strong in the power one day. Or Sharina's, she added with a grimace, hands smoothing her skirts in irritation. Sharina's potential was nothing short of remarkable, far beyond anyone in living memory except for Nynaeve, and ahead of Nynaeve as well. Some thought she might become as strong as it was possible to be, though that was only speculation. If Nicola has been bothering you, Mother, I will see to her. I was just curious, Egwene said carefully, swallowing a suggestion that the young woman and her friend both be watched closely. She did not want to talk about Nicola. It would be too easy to find herself with a choice between lying or revealing matters she dared not expose. A pity she had not allowed Swan to arrange for 2 quiet deaths. Her head jerked in shock at the thought. Had she gone that far from Emmons Field? She knew she would have to order men to die in battle sooner or later, and she thought she might be able to order a death if the need was great enough. If one death could stop the death of thousands or even hundreds, was it not right to order it? But the danger presented by Nicola and Arena was simply that they might reveal secrets that could inconvenience Egwene Alvir. Oh, Mirel and the others might be lucky to get off with a birching, and they would certainly consider that more than inconvenient. But discomfort, however great, was not sufficient reason for killing. Abruptly, Egwene realized that she was frowning, and Tiana and the 2 sitters were watching her, Janya not bothering to hide her curiosity behind a mask of serenity. To cover herself, Egwene shifted her frown to the table where Chiron and Ashmanila were once more at work. The white on Ashmanila's cup had climbed a little farther, but in just that short time Chiron had caught up. More than caught up, in fact, since her goblet stood twice as high. Your skill is improving, Chiron, Egwene said evenly. The blue looked up at her and drew a deep breath. Her oval face became an image of cool calm around those icy blue eyes. There isn't much skill involved, Mother. All that's needed is to set the weave. The last word held a touch of acridness, and for that matter there had been a slight hesitation before Mother. Chiron had been sent off from Saladar on a very important mission, only to see it collapse in a shambles, though from no fault of hers, and she had returned to them in Murundi to find everything she had left behind stood on its head, and a girl she remembered as a novice wearing the Amalin's stole. Of late, Chiron had been spending a good deal of time with Lelaine. She is improving, in some things, Janya said with a pointed frown for the blue sister. Janya might have been as sure as any other that Paul was getting a puppet when they raised Egwene, but she seemed to have accepted that Egwene did wear the stole, and deserved the proper respect from everyone. Of course, I doubt she'll catch Lyanna unless she applies herself, much less yourself, Mother. Young Bodawin might catch her, in fact. I wouldn't want to be outdone by a novice myself, but I suppose some don't feel that way. A stain of red crept into Chiron's cheeks, and her eyes dropped to the goblet. Tiana sniffed. Bodawin's a good girl, but she spends more time giggling and playing with the other novices than applying herself, she inhaled sharply. If she isn't watched. Yesterday, she and Althan Conley tried 2 items at once, just to see what would happen, and the things fused together in a solid lump. Useless for sale, of course, unless you find someone who wants a pair of half-iron, half-Quendiar cups joined at angles. And the light knows what might have happened to the girls. They didn't seem to be harmed, but who can say about the next time? Make sure there isn't a next time, Egwene said absently, her attention on Chiron's cup. The line of white crept upward steadily. When Lyanna did this weave, black iron turned to white Quendiar as if the iron were sinking quickly into milk. For Egwene herself, the change was faster than the blink of an eye, black to white in a flash. It would have to be Chiron and Lyanna, but even Lyanna was barely fast enough. Chiron needed time to improve. Days? Weeks? Whatever was necessary, because anything less meant disaster, for the women involved and for the men who would die fighting in the streets of Tarvalon, and maybe for the tower. Suddenly, Egwene was glad she had approved Bayanin's suggestion. Telling Chiron why she needed to try harder might have spurred her efforts, but this was another secret that had to be kept until the time came to unveil it to the world. Chapter 18. A Chat with Suan. Daishar had been taken away when Egwene left the tent, of course, but the 7-striped stole hanging from the opening of her cowl worked better than an Aes Sedai's face at making a way through the crowd. She moved in a ripple of curtsies, with the occasional bow thrown in from a warder or a craftsman who who had some task among the sisters' tents. Some novices squeaked when they saw the Amelins stole, and whole families stepped hurriedly off the walkway, making their deep curtsies in the mire of the street. Since she had been forced to order punishment for some of the Two Rivers women, word had spread among the novices that the Amelin was as hard as Sorella Bagand, and it was best to avoid incurring her temper, which could spring up like wildfire. Not that most of them knew enough history to have any real idea who Sorella had been, but her name had been a byword of iron-handed strictness in the tower for 100 years, and the accepted made sure that novices absorbed tidbits like that. It was a good thing that Egwene's cowl hid her face. By the 10th time a novice family leaped out of her way like frightened hares, she was gritting her teeth so hard that seeing her face would have cemented her reputation for chewing iron and spitting nails. She had the horrible feeling that in a few hundred years, Accepted would be using her name to frighten novices the way they used Sorella's now. Of course, there was the little matter of securing the White Tower first. Small irritations had to wait. She thought she could have spit nails without the iron. The crowds thinned to nothing around the Amelin's study, which was just a peaked canvas tent with patched brown walls, despite the name. Like the hall, it was a place to be avoided unless you had business there or were summoned. No one was simply asked to the hall of the tower or the Amelin's study. The most innocuous invitation to either was a summons, a fact that turned that simple tent into a haven. Sweeping through the entry flaps, she swung her cloak off with a feeling of relief. A pair of braziers made the tent deliciously warm after outside, and they gave off very little smoke. A touch of sweet scent lingered from the dried herbs that had been sprinkled on the glowing embers. "The way those fool girls behave, you would think she began in a growl, and cut off abruptly. She was not surprised to see Swan standing beside the writing table in plain blue wool, finely cut but simple, a wide, tooled leather folder held to her chest. Most sisters still seemed to believe, like Delana, that she was reduced to instructing Egwene in protocol and running errands, grudgingly in both cases, but she was always there, bright and early, which seemed to have gone unnoticed so far. Swan had been an Amelin who chewed iron, though no one would believe who did not already know. Novices pointed her out as often as they did Lyanna, but with an air of doubt that she really was who the sisters said. Pretty, if not quite beautiful, with a delicate mouth and dark glossy hair to her shoulders, Swan looked even younger than Lyanna, only a few years older than Egwene. She could have been taken for one of the accepted without the blue-fringed shawl draped across her arms. That was why she never went without the shawl, to avoid embarrassing mistakes. Her eyes had not changed any more than her spirit, however, and they were icy blue awls aimed at the woman whose presence was a surprise. Halima was certainly welcome, yet Egwene had not expected to see her stretched out on the brightly colored cushions that were piled along one side of the tent, her head propped on one hand. Where Swan was pretty, the sort of young woman, seemingly young at least, who made men and women alike smile at her, Halima was stunning, with big green eyes and a perfect face, and a full, firm bosom, the sort who made men swallow and other women frown. Not that Egwene frowned, or believed the tales carried by women jealous of the way Halima attracted men just by being. She could not help the way she looked, after all. But even if her position as Delana's secretary was plainly a matter of charity by the Grey sisters, a poorly educated countrywoman, Halima formed her letters with the awkwardness of a young child, Delana usually kept her busy all day with some sort of make-work. She seldom appeared before time for bed, and then it was nearly always because she had heard Egwene had one of her heads. Nisao could do nothing with those headaches, even using the new healing, but Halima's massages worked wonders, even when the pain had Egwene whimpering. "I told her you wouldn't have time for visits this morning, Mother," Swan said sharply, still glaring at the woman on the cushions as she took Egwene's cloak with her free hand. "But I might as well have played cat's cradle with myself as opened my mouth." Hanging the cloak on the rustic cloak stand, she snorted contemptuously. "Maybe if I wore breeches and had a mustache, she'd pay mind." Swan seemed to believe every one of the rumors about Halima's supposed depredations among prettier craftsmen and soldiers. Strangely, Halima seemed amused by her reputation. She might even have enjoyed it. She laughed, low and throaty, and stretched on the cushions like a cat. She did have an unfortunate liking for low-cut bodices, incredible in this weather, and she nearly came out of her blue-slashed-green silk. Silk was hardly the usual garb for a secretary, but Delana's charity ran deep, or her debt to Halima did. "You seemed worried this morning, Mother," the green-eyed woman murmured. "And you slipped out so early for your ride, trying not to wake me. I thought you might like to talk. You wouldn't get so many headaches if you talked over your worries more. Of course, you know you can talk to me." Eyeing Swan, who was tearing down her nose painfully, Halima gave another smoky laugh. "And you know I didn't want anything from you. Unlike so." Swan snorted again and deliberately busied herself with placing the folder on the writing table, just so, between the stone inkwell and the sand jar. She even fiddled with the pen rest. With an effort, Egwene managed not to sigh. Just. Halima did ask for nothing beyond a pallet in Egwene's tent, so she could be on hand when one of Egwene's headaches came on, and sleeping there must have given difficulties with carrying out her duties for Delana. Besides, Egwene liked her earthy, outspoken manner. It was very easy to talk to Halima and forget for a little while that she was the Amerlin seat, a relaxation she could not have even with Swan. She had fought too hard for recognition as Aes Sedai and Amerlin, and her grip on that recognition was too tenuous. Every slip from being Amerlin would make the next slip easier, and the next after that, until she was back to being regarded as a child at play. That made Halima a luxury to be treasured, quite apart from what her fingers could do to Egwene's headaches. To her annoyance, though, every other woman in the camp appeared to share Swan's view, with the possible exception of Delana. The Grey seemed too prudish to employ a light skirt, no matter what charity she thought she owed. In any case, whether the woman chased men or even tripped them up was beside the point now. "I'm afraid I do have work, Halima," she said, tugging off her gloves. A mountain of work, most days. There was no sign of Shiriam's reports on the table yet, of course, but she would be sending them soon, along with a few petitions she thought merited Egwene's attention. Just a few, 10 or 12 appeals for redress of grievances, with Egwene expected to pass the Amerlin's judgment on each. You could not do that without study and questions, not and hand down a just decision. "Perhaps you can have dinner with me." If she finished in time to do more than eat at her table right there in her study. It was getting on toward midday already. "We can talk then." Halima sat up abruptly, eyes flashing and full lips compressed, but her scowl vanished as quickly as it had come. A smoldering remained in her eyes, though. Had she been a cat, she would have had her back arched and her tail like a bottle brush. Rising gracefully to her feet on the layered carpets, she smoothed her dress over her hips. "Very well, then, if you're certain you don't want me to stay." With remarkable timing, a dull throb began behind Egwene's eyes, an all-too-familiar precursor to a blinding headache. But she shook her head anyway and repeated that she had work to do. Halima hesitated a moment longer, her mouth going tight once more, hands fisting in her skirts. Then she snatched her fur-lined silk cloak from the cloak stand and stalked out of the tent without bothering to pull the garment around her shoulders. She could do herself an injury going about like that in the cold. "That fishwife temper will get her in trouble sooner or later," Swan muttered before the entry flaps stopped swaying. Scowling after Halima, she twitched her shawl up onto her shoulders. "The woman holds it in around you, but she doesn't mind giving me the rough side of her tongue, me or anybody else. She's been heard screaming at Delana. Who ever heard of a secretary screaming at her employer? And a sister at that? A sitter? I don't understand why Delana puts up with her." "That's Delana's business, surely." Questioning another sister's actions was just as forbidden as interfering with them. Only by custom, not law. Yet some customs were as strong as law. Surely she did not have to remind Swan of that. Rubbing her temples, Egwene sat down carefully in the chair behind her writing table, but the chair wobbled anyway. Designed to fold for storage on a wagon, the legs had a habit of folding when they were not supposed to, and none of the carpenters had been able to fix them after repeated attempts. The table folded as well, but that held up more firmly. She wished she had taken the opportunity to acquire a new chair in Mirandy, yet there had been so many things that needed buying, and not enough coin to stretch when she already had a chair. At least she had acquired a pair of stand lamps and a table lamp, all three plain red-painted iron, but with good mirrors that were free of bubbles. Good light did not seem to help her headaches, yet it was better than trying to read by a few tallow candles and a lantern. If Swan heard any rebuke, it did not slow her down. It's more than just a temper. Once or twice I've thought she was on the brink of trying to strike me. I suppose she has sense enough to hold back from that, but not everyone has eyes to die. I'm convinced she managed to break a wheelwright's arm somehow. He says he fell, but he looks to be lying to me, with his eyes shifting and his mouth twitching. He wouldn't like admitting a woman bent his elbow backwards, now would he? Give over, Swan, Egwene said wearily. The man likely tried to take liberties. He must have. She could not see how Halima could have broken a man's arm in any event. However you described the woman, muscular did not come into it. Instead of opening the embossed folder that Swan had laid on the table, she rested her hands on either side of it. That kept them away from her head. Maybe if she ignored the pain, it would go away this time. Besides, for a change, she had information to share with Swan. It seems that some of the sitters are talking about negotiating with Elida, she began. Expressionless, Swan balanced herself atop one of the two rickety three-legged stools in front of the table and listened attentively, only her fingers moving, lightly stroking against her skirts, until Egwene finished. Then she made fists and growled a set of curses that were pungent even for her, beginning with a wish for the lot of them to choke to death on weak old fish guts, and sliding downhill fast from there. Coming from that young, pretty face only made them
Diablo 3.
I suppose you're right letting it go forward, she muttered, once her invective ran down. The talk will spread now it's begun, and this way you gain a jump on it. Bayanin shouldn't surprise me, I suppose. Bayanin's ambitious, but I always thought she'd have gone scurrying back to the valley if Shiriam and the others hadn't stiffened her backbone. Voice quickening, Swan fixed her eyes on Egwene and straight to his words. I wish Varilyn and that lot surprised me, Mother. Discounting the blue, 6 sitters from 5 Ajas fled the tower after Elida carried out her coup. Her mouth twisted slightly on the word. And here we have one from each of those 5. I was in Tel Riod last night in the tower. I hoped you were careful, Egwene said sharply. Swan hardly seemed to know the meaning of careful sometimes. The few dream Turangreal in their possession had lines of sisters panting to use them, mostly to visit the tower. And while Swan was not precisely forbidden one, it was the next thing to. She could have put her name down forever without the hall granting her a single night. Quite aside from the sisters who blamed Swan for the tower being broken in the first place, she was not accepted back quite as warmly as Lyanna on that account, nor cosseted by anyone. Quite aside from that, too many remembered her rough teaching when she was one of the few who knew how to use the dream Turangreal. Swan did not suffer fools gladly, and everyone was a fool their first few times in Tel Riod. So now she had to borrow Lyanna's turn when she wanted to visit the world of dreams. And if another sister saw her there, the next thing to might become an outright ban. Or worse, set off a search for who had loaned her a Turangreal, which might end by unmasking Lyanna. In Tel Riod, Swan said with a dismissive gesture, I'm a different woman in a different dress every time I turn a corner. That was good to hear, though it seemed likely a lack of control had as much to do with it as intent. Swan's belief in her own abilities was sometimes greater than warranted. The point is, last night I saw a partial list of sitters and managed to read most of the names before it changed to a tally of wines. That was a common occurrence in Tel Riyadh, where nothing stayed the same for long unless it was a reflection of something permanent in the waking world. Andaya Foray was raised for the gray, Rena Hafton for the green, and Juliane Madoma for the brown. None has worn the shawl more than 70 years at most. Elida has the same problem we do, Mother. I see, Egwene said slowly. She realized that she was massaging the side of her head. The throb behind her eyes beat on. It would grow stronger. It always did. By nightfall, she was going to regret having sent Halima away. Bringing her hand down firmly, she moved the leather folder in front of her a half-inch to the left, then slid it back. What of the rest? They had 6 sitters to replace. Farana Neheran was raised for the white, Suan admitted, and Suana Dragand for the yellow. They've both been in the hall before. It was only a partial list, and I didn't get to read it all. Her back straightened and her chin shot out stubbornly. 1 or 2 raised before time would be unusual enough. It happens, but not often. But this makes 11, maybe 12, but 11 for sure, between us and the tower. I don't believe in coincidences that big. When the fishmongers are all buying at the same price, you can bet they were all drinking at the same inn last night. You don't have to convince me anymore, Suan. With a sigh, Egwene sat back, automatically catching the chair leg that always tried to fold when she did that. Clearly something odd was happening. But what did it mean? And who could influence the choice of sitters in every Ajah? Every Ajah except the blue, at least. They had chosen 1 new sitter, but Moria had been Aes Sedai well over 100 years. And maybe the red was not affected. No one knew what changes, if any, had been made in the red sitters. The black might be behind it, but what could they gain, unless all of those 2 young sitters were black? That seemed impossible in any case. If the Black Ajah had had that much influence, the hall would have been all dark friends long ago. Yet if there was a pattern and coincidence would not hold, then someone had to be at the heart of it. Just thinking about the possibilities, the impossibilities, made the dull pain behind her eyes grow a little sharper. If this turns out to be happenstance after all, Suan, you're going to regret ever thinking you saw a puzzle. She forced a smile saying that, to take out any sting. And Amerlin had to be careful with her words. Now that you've convinced me there is a puzzle, I want you to solve it. Who is responsible and what are they after? Until we know that, we don't know anything. Is that all you want? Suan said dryly. Before supper or after? After we'll have to do, I suppose, Egwene snapped, then took a deep breath at the abashed look on the other woman's face. There was no point taking her headache out on Suan. And Amerlin's words had power, and sometimes consequences. She had to remember that. As soon as you can would be very good, though, she said in a milder voice. I know you'll be as quick as you can. Chagrined or not, Suan seemed to understand that Egwene's outburst came from more than her own sarcasm. Despite her youthful appearance, she had years of practice at reading faces. Shall I go find Halima? She said, half rising. The lack of tartness attached to the woman's name was a measure of her concern. It won't take a minute. If I give way for every ache, I'll never get anything done, Egwene said, opening the folder. Now what do you have for me today? She kept her hands on the papers, though, to stop from rubbing her head. One of Suan's tasks each morning was to fetch what the Ajahs were willing to share from their networks of eyes and ears, along with whatever individual sisters had passed on to their Ajahs, and the Ajahs had decided to pass on to Egwene. It was a strange process of sieving, yet it still gave a fair picture of the world when added to what Suan put in. She had managed to hold on to the agents that had been hers as Amerlin by the simple expedient of refusing to tell anyone who they were, despite every effort by the hall, and in the end no one could gainsay that those eyes and ears were the armament, and that they should by rights report to Egwene. Oh, there had been no end of grumbling over it, and still was on occasion, but no one could deny the facts. As usual, the first report came from neither the Ajas nor Siuan, but Lyanna, written on thin sheets of paper in a flowing, elegant hand. Egwene could not see exactly why, but she could never doubt that anything Lyanna wrote had been written by a woman. Those pages Egwene held to the table lamp's flame one by one as soon as she read them, letting the paper burn almost to her fingers, then crumpling the ash. It would hardly do for her and Lyanna to behave like mere strangers in public, then allow one of her reports to fall into the wrong hands. Very few sisters were aware that Lyanna had eyes and ears inside Tar Valon itself. She might have been the only sister who did. It was a human failing to watch keenly what was happening down the street while ignoring what lay right at your feet, and the light knew Aes Sedai had as many human failings as anyone else. Unfortunately, Lyanna had little new to communicate. Her people in the city complained of filthy streets that were increasingly dangerous after dark and little safer by daylight. Once, crime had been all but unknown in Tar Valon, but now the tower guards had abandoned the streets to patrol the harbors and the bridge towers. Except for collecting the customs duties and buying supplies, both done through intermediaries, the White Tower seemed to have shut itself off from the city completely. The great doors that allowed the public to enter the tower remained shut and barred, and no one had seen a sister outside the tower to know her as Aes Sedai since the siege began, if not earlier. All confirmation of what Lyanna had reported before. The last page made Egwene's eyebrows rise, though. Rumor in the streets said Gareth Bryn had found a secret way into the city, and would appear inside the walls with his whole army any day. Lyanna would have said if anyone had breathed a word that sounded like they meant gateways, Siuan said quickly when she saw Egwene's expression. She had read all of these reports already, of course, and knew what Egwene was seeing by which page she held. Shifting on the unsteady stool, Siuan almost fell off onto the carpet she was paying so little heed. It did not slow her down a hair, though. And you can be sure Gareth hasn't let anything slip, she went on, while still righting herself. Not that any of his soldiers are fool enough to desert to the city now, but he knows when to keep his mouth shut. He just has the reputation for attacking where he can't possibly be. He's done the impossible often enough that people expect him to, that's all. Hiding a smile, Egwene held the paper mentioning Lord Gareth to the flame and watched it curl and blacken. A few months passed. Siuan would have offered an acid comment about the man instead of praise. He would have been Gareth Bloody Bryn, not Gareth. She could not possibly miss doing his laundry and polishing his boots. But Egwene had seen her staring at him on those rare times when he came to the Aes Sedai camp. Staring and then running away if he so much as glanced at her. Siuan! Running away! Siuan had been Aes Sedai for more than 20 years and Amyrlin for 10, but she had no more idea how to deal with being in love than a duck had about shearing sheep. Egwene crumbled the ash and dusted her hands together, her smile fading. She had no room to talk about Siuan. She was in love, too, but she did not even know where in the world Gawain was, or what to do if she learned. He had his duty to Andor, and she hers to the tower, and the one way to bridge that chasm, bonding him, might lead to his death. Better to let him go, forget him entirely, as easy as forgetting her own name. And she would bond him. She knew that. Of course, she could not bond the man without knowing where he was, without having her hands on him, so it all came full circle. Men were a bother. Pausing to press her fingers against her temples, it did nothing to lessen the pulsing pain. She put Gawain out of her mind, as far out as she could. She thought she had a foretaste of what it was like having a warder. There was always something of Gawain in the back of her head, and liable to kick its way into her consciousness at the most inconvenient time. Concentrating on the business at hand, she picked up the next sheet. Much of the world had vanished as far as eyes and ears were concerned. Little news came from the lands held by the Shanshan, and that divided between fanciful descriptions of Shanshan beasts delivered as proof they were using shadow spawn, horrifying tales of women being tested to see whether they should be collared as damani, and depressing stories of acceptance. The Shanshan, it seemed, were no worse rulers than any others, and better than some, as long as you were not a woman on the channel, and all too many people appeared to have given up thoughts of resistance, and it became clear the Shanshan would let them go on with their lives. Aragyanat was almost as bad, producing nothing but rumors, admitted as such by the sisters who wrote the reports, but included just to show the state the country was in. King Al-Salam was dead. No, he had begun channeling and gone mad. Rodel Ituralda, the great captain, also was dead, or he had usurped the throne, or was invading Saldaea. The Council of Merchants were all dead as well, or had fled the country, or begun a civil war over who the next king was to be. Any of those might have been true, or none. The Ajahs were accustomed to seeing everything, but now a third of the world had been enveloped in dense fog, with only the tiniest gaps. At least, if there were any clearer views, no Ajah had deigned to pass on what they saw there. Another problem was that the Ajahs saw different things as having paramount importance and largely ignored anything else. The Greens, for example, were particularly concerned over tales of borderland armies near New Brain, hundreds of leagues from the blight they were supposed to be guarding. Their report talked of the borderlanders, and only the borderlanders, as if something had to be done and done now. Not that they suggested anything or so much as hinted, yet frustrations came through in the cramped, hasty handwriting that spidered urgently across the page. Egwene had the truth of that situation from Elaine, but she was content to let the Greens gnash their teeth for the moment, since Swan had revealed why they were not rushing off to set matters straight. According to her agent in New Brain, the Borderlanders were accompanied by 50 or 100 sisters, perhaps 200. The number of Aes Sedai might be uncertain, and it must be wildly inflated, of course, but their presence was a fact the Greens had to be aware of, though the reports they sent to Egwene had mentioned them. No Ajah had mentioned those sisters in their reports. In the end, though, there was little difference between 200 sisters and 2. No one could be certain who those sisters were, or why they were there, yet poking a nose in would surely be seen as interfering. It seemed strange that they could be engaged in a war between Aes Sedai and still be held back from interfering with another sister by custom, but thankfully it was so. At least they don't suggest sending anyone to Caemlyn. Egwene blinked, the pain behind her eyes sharpened by following the tight letters. Swan gave a derisive snort. Why should they? As far as they know, Elaine is letting Marililla and Bandine guide her, so they're sure they'll get their Aes Sedai queen, and a green at that. Besides, as long as the Ashamans stay out of Caemlyn, no one wants to take the chance of stirring them up. The way things stand, we might as well try pulling wasp jellies out of the water with our bare hands, and even the Greens know it. Anyway, that won't stop some sister, green or otherwise, from dropping into Caemlyn. Just a quiet visit to see one of her eyes and ears, or to have a dress made, or buy a saddle, or the light knows why else. Even the Greens? Egwene said tartly. Everyone thought of browns being this way and whites that, even when it was demonstrably not so. Yet sometimes she bristled a little at hearing greens lumped together as if they were all the same woman. Maybe she did think of herself as a green, or as having been one, which was silly. The Amerlin was of all Ajahs and none. She adjusted the stole on her shoulders, reminding herself of the fact represented by those 7 stripes, and she had never belonged to one in the first place. Yet she did feel not fondness, that was too strong, a sense of sameness between herself and Green sisters. How many sisters are unaccounted for, Suan? Even the weakest can travel wherever they want, linked, and I wish I knew where they went. For a moment, Swan frowned in thought. "About 20, I think," she said finally. "Maybe a few less. The number changes day to day. No one keeps track, really. No sister would stand still for it." She leaned forward, carefully balancing herself this time when the uneven legs made her stool lurch. "You've juggled matters beautifully so far, Mother, but it can't last. Eventually, the Hall will find out everything that's going on in Camelin. They might accept keeping the Shanshan prisoners secret. That will be seen as Van Dien's business or Marilla's, but they already know there are sea folk in Camelin, and they'll learn about the bargain with them sooner or later. And the kin, if not your plans for them." Swan snorted again, though faintly. She was not certain how she herself felt about the idea of Aes Sedai retiring into the kin, much less how other sisters would take to the notion. "My eyes and ears haven't picked up a glimmer yet, but somebody's will, as sure as certain. You can't delay much longer, or we'll find ourselves wading through a school of silverpike." "One of these days," Egwene muttered, "I'll have to see these silverpike you're always talking about." She held up a hand as the other woman opened her mouth. "One day." "The agreement with the sea folk will cause problems," she confessed. "But when the Ajahs hear hints, they won't realize right away what they're hearing. Sisters teaching sea folk in Camelin? It's unheard of. But who is going to ask questions or interfere against all custom? I'm sure there will be all sorts of grumbling, maybe some questions called in the hall, but before it comes out that there is a bargain, I will have introduced my plan for the kin." "You think that won't sharpen their teeth?" Shifting her shawl, Swan barely bothered to hide her incredulity. In fact, she scowled with it. "It will cause argument," Egwene allowed judiciously. Considerable understatement. It would cause an uproar, was what it would do once the whole was known. Likely as close to a riot as had ever been seen among Aes Sedai. But the tower had been dwindling for 1,000 years now, if not more, and she planned to put an end to that. "But I do intend to go slowly. Aes Sedai may be reluctant to talk about age, Swan, but they'll figure out soon enough that swearing on the oath rod shortens our lives by half at least. No one wants to die before they must." "If they're convinced there really is a kinswoman who's 600 years old," Swan said in grudging tones, and Egwene sighed with vexation. That was another thing the other woman was uncertain about, the kin's claims of longevity. She valued Swan's advice, valued that she did not just say what Egwene wanted to hear, but at times the woman seemed to drag her heels as hard as Ramonda or Lelaine. "If need be, Swan," she said irritably, "I'll just let the sisters talk to a few women 100 years or more older than any of them. They may try to dismiss them as wilders and liars, but Rihanna Corley can prove she was in the tower and when. So can others. With luck, I'll convince the sisters to accept being freed of the 3 oaths so they can retire into the kin before they ever learn there's a bargain with the Ata-Anmier. And once they accept any sister being freed of the oaths, it won't be nearly as hard to convince them to let the Sea Folk sisters go. Beside that, the rest of that agreement is small turnips. As you keep saying, skill and a deft hand are necessary to get anything done in the hall, but luck is absolutely required. Well, I'll be as skillful and deft as I can be, and as for luck, the odds seem to be in my favor for once." Swan grimaced and hemmed and hawed, but she had to agree in the end. She even agreed that Egwene might pull it off, with luck and timing. Not that she was convinced about the kin or the agreement with the Ata-Anmier, either one, but what Egwene proposed was so unprecedented that it seemed the greater part of it might pass the hall before they realized what was falling on them. Egwene was willing to settle for that. Whatever was laid before the hall, almost always enough sitters stood in opposition to make finding a consensus hard work at best, and nothing was done in the hall without at least the lesser consensus, and usually not without the greater. It seemed to her that most dealings with the hall consisted of convincing them to do what they did not want to. There was certainly no reason for this to be any different. While the Greens concentrated on the Borderlanders, the Greys focused south at present. Every Aja was fascinated by the reports from Ilion and Tyr of large numbers of wilders among the seafolk, which they found interesting if true, though there seemed strong doubt that it could be true, or else sisters would have known about it before this. After all, how could such a thing be hidden? No one mentioned that they had just accepted what they saw on the surface and never looked deeper. The Greys, though, were fascinated by the continued Shanshan threat to Ilion and the recently begun siege of the Stone of Tyr. Wars and threats of war always mesmerized Greys, since they were dedicated to ending strife, and to extending their influence, of course. Every time the Greys stopped a war with a treaty, they increased the influence of all Aes Sedai, but of Greys most of all. The Shanshan seemed beyond negotiation, however, at least by Aes Sedai, and the Greys' outraged sense of being thwarted came through in curt words about Shanshan's incursions across the border, and the increasing forces being gathered by Lord Gregorin, the steward in Ilion for the Dragon Reborn, a title that was a matter of some concern in itself. Tyr had its own steward for the Dragon Reborn, the High Lord Darlin Cisnera, and he was besieged in the stone by nobles who refused to accept Rand. It was a very strange siege. The stone had its own docks, and Darlin's enemies could not cut off supplies, even holding the rest of the city as they did, and they seemed content to sit and wait in any event. Or perhaps they just could not see what to do next. Only the Aiel had ever taken the stone by assault, and no one had ever starved it out. The Greys had some hopes in Tyr. Egwene's head came up as she read to the bottom of the page, and she hurriedly set that page down and picked up the next. The Greys had had some hopes. Apparently a Grey sister had been recognized coming out of the stone and followed to a meeting with High Lord Tadosian and High Lady Estunda, two of the most prominent among the besiegers. "Marana," she breathed. "They say it was Marana Ambry, Swan." Unconsciously, she massaged her temple. The pain behind her eyes had ratcheted a little higher. "She may do some good." Rising, Swan crossed the carpets to a small table against the tent wall, where several mismatched cups and two pitchers sat on a tray. The silver pitcher held spiced wine and blue-glazed pottery tea, both set there at first light against the Amerlin's arrival, and both long since gone cold. No one had expected Egwene to go riding off to the river. As long as Tadosian and the others don't realize who she's really working for. Swan's shawl slipped off one shoulder as she felt the side of the pottery pitcher, and the light of Sidar surrounded her briefly as she channeled fire, warming the contents. They won't trust her to negotiate in good faith if they find out she's the Dragon Reborn's creature. Filling a polished pewter cup with tea, she added generous dollops from the honey jar, stirring it in well, and brought the cup back to Egwene. "This might help your head. It's some sort of herb concoction Chesa found, but honey cuts the taste." Egwene took a cautious sip and set the cup down with a shudder. If it tasted that sharp with honey, she did not want to imagine it without. The headache might be better. "How can you take this so calmly, Swan? Marana turning up in Tyr is the first real proof we've had. I'll take your sitters as coincidence before that." In the beginning, there had only been whispers, from the Ajas or from Swan's eyes and ears. There were Aes Sedai in Cairhien, and they seemed to move freely in and out of the Sun Palace while the Dragon Reborn was there. Then the whispers grew hoarse and uneasy, hesitant. The eyes and ears in Cairhien did not want to say it. No one wanted to repeat what their agents said. There were Aes Sedai in Cairhien, and they seemed to be following the orders of the Dragon Reborn. Worse were the names that trickled out. Some were women who had been in Salidar, among the first to resist Elida, while others were women known to be loyal to Elida. No one had mentioned compulsion aloud that Egwene knew of, but they had to be thinking it. "No use pulling your hair when the wind isn't blowing the way you want," Swan replied, taking her stool again. She started to cross her knees, but hastily put both feet back on the carpet when her stool tilted. Muttering under her breath, she adjusted her shawl with a twitch of her shoulders and was forced to balance against another lurch. You have to trim your sails to take advantage of how the wind is blowing. Think coolly and you'll make it back to shore.
I'll be right back.
Get your neck hot and you'll drown. Sometimes Swan could sound as if she still worked a fishing boat. I believe you need more than one sip for that to do any good, Mother. With a grimace, Egwene pushed the cup a little farther from her. The taste clinging to her tongue was at least as bad as her headache. Swan, if you see a way to make use of this, I wish you'd tell me. I don't even want to think about using the fact that Rand may have compelled sisters. I don't want to think about the possibility that he could have. Neither about the possibility that he knew such a repulsive weave, or that he could lay that weave on anyone. She knew it, another little gift from Wolverine, and she very much wished she could forget how to make it. In this case, it isn't so much a matter of using as figuring out the effects. He'll have to be dealt with eventually and maybe taught a lesson, but you don't want sisters flying off after him now, and these tales out of Kyrian make everyone cautious. Swan's voice was calm enough, but she fidgeted, clearly agitated inwardly. It was nothing any Aes Sedai could speak of too calmly. At the same time, once everyone thinks it through, they'll realize this makes nonsense out of those stories about him submitting to Elida. She might have sent sisters to watch over him, but they wouldn't accept sisters who want to pull Elida down. Realizing that will put a little backbone in those who've started thinking maybe Elida has him on a lead. That's one less reason for anyone to consider yielding to her. What about Cadsuane? Egwene said. Of all the names coming out of Kyrian, that one had sent the most shock through the sisters. Cadsuane Malydrin was a legend, and there were as many disapproving versions of the legend as approving. Some sisters had been sure it must be a mistake. Cadsuane must be dead by now. Others just appeared to wish she were dead. Are you certain she remained in Kyrian after Rand disappeared? I made sure my people kept an eye on her as soon as I heard her name, Swan said, no longer sounding at all calm. I don't know if she's a dark friend, I just suspect, but I can guarantee that she was in the Sun Palace a week after he vanished. Squeezing her eyes shut, Egwene pressed the heels of her palms against her lids. That hardly seemed to affect the pulsing needle in her head. Maybe Rand was in company with a Black Sister, or had been. Maybe he had used compulsion on Aes Sedai. Bad enough on anyone, but somehow worse used on Aes Sedai, more ominous. What was dared against Aes Sedai was 10 times, 100 times as likely to be used against those who could not defend themselves. Eventually they would have to deal with him somehow. She had grown up with Rand, yet she could not allow that to influence her. He was the Dragon Reborn now, the hope of the world, and at the same time maybe the single greatest threat the world faced. Maybe. The Shan could not do as much damage as the Dragon Reborn, and she was going to use the possibility that he had compelled sisters. The Amerlin seat really was a different woman from that innkeeper's daughter. Scowling at the pewter cup of so-called tea, she picked it up and made herself drink the vile stuff down, gagging and spluttering the whole way. Perhaps the taste would take her mind off her headache, at least. As she set the cup down with a sharp clink of metal on wood, Anaya pushed into the tent, mouth turned down, and a frown creasing her plain face. Akarin and the others have returned, Mother, she said. Moria told me to inform you she has called the hall to hear their report. So have Esmeralda and Malend, Morvern announced, coming in behind Anaya with Mirel. The green seemed an image of serene fury, if that was possible, her olive face smooth and her eyes like dark embers, but Morvern wore a scowl to make Anaya look pleased. They're sending novices and accepted running to find all the sitters, the Brown said. We can't catch a whisper of what Akarin found, but I think Esmeralda and the others intend to use it to prod the hall towards something. Peering at the dark dregs floating in a few drops in the bottom of the pewter cup, Egwene sighed. She would have to be there too, and now she would have to face the sitters with a headache and that awful taste in her mouth. Perhaps she could call it a penance for what she was going to do to the hall. Chapter 19. Surprises. By custom, the Amerlin was informed of the hall sitting, yet nothing said they had to wait for her before starting the session, which meant that time might be short. Egwene wanted to leap to her feet and march straight to the big pavilion before Moria and the other two could spring whatever surprise they intended. Surprises in the hall were seldom good. Surprises you learned about late were worse. Still, protocols that were law, not custom, had to be followed for the Amerlin entering the hall. So she remained where she was, and sent Suan to fetch Shiriam so she could be announced properly by the keeper of the chronicles. Suan had told her that was really a matter of warning the sitters of her presence. There were always matters they might want to discuss without the Amerlin knowing, and she had not sounded entirely as if she were making a joke. In any case, there was no point in going to the hall until she could enter. Tamping down her impatience, she propped her head on her hands and massaged her temples as she tried to read a little more of the Aja reports. Despite the vile tea, or perhaps because of it, her headache made the words shimmer on the page every time she blinked, and Anaya and the other two did not help. No sooner did Suan depart than Anaya tossed back her cloak, settling on the stool Suan had vacated. It did not seem to lurch under her, uneven legs or no, and began to speculate on what Moria and the others were after. She was not a flighty woman, so her ventures were quite constrained, given the circumstances. Constrained, but no less upsetting for that. "Frightened people do silly things, Mother, even Aes Sedai," she murmured, placing her hands on her knees. "But at least you can be sure Moria will be firm about Elida, at least in the long run. She lays every sister who died after Suan was deposed right at Elida's feet. Moria wants Elida birched for every single death before she goes to the headsman. A hard woman, harder than Lelaine in some ways, tougher anyway. She won't scruple at things that might make Lelaine balk. I'm very much afraid she will press for an assault on the city as soon as possible. If the Forsaken are moving so openly on such a scale, then better a wounded tower that's whole than a tower divided. At least, I fear that's how Moria may see things. After all, however much time we want to avoid sisters killing sisters, it wouldn't be the first time. The tower has lasted a long time and healed from many wounds. We can heal from this one, too." Anaya's voice suited her face, warm and patient and comforting, but making those remarks it seemed like fingernails screeching down a slat. Light, for all Anaya saying this was what she feared out of Moria, she seemed much in accord with the sentiments. She was deliberate, unflappable, and never careless with words. If she favored an assault, how many others did too? As usual, Mirelle was anything but constrained. Mercurial and fiery described her best. She would not know patience if it bit her on the nose. She paced back and forth, as much as the confines of the tent allowed, kicking her deep green skirts and sometimes kicking one of the bright cushions piled against the wall before turning to make another round. If Moria is frightened enough to press for an assault, then she's frightened out of her wits. A tower too wounded to stand alone won't be able to face the Forsaken or anyone else. Malind is who should concern you. She's always pointing out that Tarmangaiden could be upon us any day. I've heard her say that what we felt could well have been the opening blows of the last battle, and that it might happen here next. Where better for the shadow to strike than Tar Valon? Malind has never been afraid to make hard choices, or to retreat when she thought it necessary. She would abandon Tar Valon and the tower at once if she thought it would preserve at least some of us for Tarmangaiden. She will propose lifting the siege, fleeing somewhere the Forsaken can't find us until we're ready to strike back. If she puts the question to the hall in the right way, she might even get the greater consensus and support. The very thought made the words dance harder on the page in front of Egwene. Morvrin, her round face unrelenting, simply planted fists on ample hips and met each suggestion with a curt answer. "We don't know enough yet to be sure it was the Forsaken, and you can't know until she says. Perhaps it was, and perhaps not, and supposition isn't evidence." It was said she would not believe it was morning till she saw the sun for herself. Her firm voice brooked no nonsense, especially jumps to conclusions. It was not soothing to an aching head, either. She was not opposing the suggestions, really, just keeping an open mind. An open mind could go either way when it came down to the sticking point. Egwene slapped the embossed folder shut on the reports with a loud smack. Between the disgusting taste on her tongue and the sharp throb in her head, not to mention their incessant voices, she could not keep her place to read anyway. The three sisters looked at her in surprise. She had made it clear long ago that she was in charge, but she tried not to show temper. Oaths of fealty or no oaths of fealty, a young woman displaying temper was too easy to dismiss as sulky, which only made her angrier, which made her head hurt more, which... "I've waited long enough," she said, making an effort to keep her voice smooth. Her head gave it a slight edge of sharpness anyway. Perhaps Shiriam thought she was supposed to meet her at the hall. Gathering her cloak, she strode out into the cold while still swinging it around her shoulders, and Morvran and the other two hesitated only a moment before following in her wake. Accompanying her to the hall might seem a little like they were her entourage, but they were supposed to be watching her, and she suspected that even Morvran was eager to hear what a Karen had to report, and what Moria and the rest intended to fashion from it. Nothing too difficult to deal with, Egwene hoped, nothing like what Anaya and Beryl thought. If necessary, she could try applying the law of war, but even if that was successful, ruling by edict had its disadvantages. When people had to obey you in one thing, they always found ways to wriggle away on others, and the more they were forced to obey, the more places they found for wriggling away. It was a natural balance you could not escape. Worse, she had learned just how addictive it was to have people jump when she spoke. You came to take it as the natural way of things, and then, when they failed to jump, you were caught on the wrong foot. Besides, with her head pounding, it was pounding now, not throbbing, though perhaps not as sharply. With her head, she was ready to snap at anyone who looked at her crosswise, and even when people had to swallow it, that never went down well. The sun stood straight overhead, a golden ball in a blue sky with a scattering of white clouds, but it gave no warmth, only wan shadows and a glitter to the snow wherever it remained untrampled. The air felt as chill as it had by the river. Egwene ignored the cold, refused to let it touch her, but only the dead could have been unaware, with everyone's breath misting white in front of their faces. It was time for the midday meal, yet there was no possibility of feeding so many novices at once, so Egwene and her escort still moved through a wave of white-clad women, leaping out of their way and starting to curtsy in the street. She set such a pace that they were usually passed before the knots of novices could more than spread their skirts. It was not a long way, with only 4 places that they needed to wade across the muddy streets. There had been talk of wooden bridges, tall enough to ride under, but bridges suggested a permanence to the camp that no one wanted. Even the sisters who spoke of them never pressed to have them built, which left wading slowly and taking care to keep your skirts and cloak high if you were not to arrive filthy to your knees. At least the remaining crowds vanished as they approached the hall. That stood alone as always, or nearly so. Nisao and Carlinia were already waiting in front of the big canvas pavilion with its patched side curtains, the tiny yellow fretting her underlip with her teeth and eyeing Egwene anxiously. Carlinia was calmness itself, cool-eyed, hands folded at her waist, except that she had forgotten her cloak. Mud stained the scroll-embroidered hem of her pale skirt, and her cap of dark curls badly needed a comb. Making their courtesies, the pair joined Anaya and the other 2, a little distance behind Egwene. The lot of them murmured softly, the snatches that Egwene caught innocuous, about the weather, or how long they might have to wait. This was no place for them to seem too closely associated with her. Bayanin came down the walk at a run, her hurried breath misting, and skidded to a halt, staring at Egwene before joining the others. The strain around her blue-gray eyes was even more apparent than earlier. Perhaps she thought this would affect her negotiations. But she knew the talks would be a sham, just a ploy to gain time. Egwene controlled her breathing and practiced novice exercises, yet none of it helped her head. It never did. There was no sign of Shiriam among the tents in any direction, but they were not precisely alone on the walkway outside the pavilion. Karen and the 5 other sisters who had gone with her, one from each Ajah, were waiting in a cluster on the other side of the entrance. Most offered curtsies to Egwene distractedly, yet kept their distance. Perhaps they had been warned to say nothing to anyone until they spoke before the hall. Egwene could simply have demanded their report on the spot, of course. They might even have given it to the Amyrlin. Likely they would have. On the other hand, an Amyrlin's relations with the Ajahs were always delicate, often including the Ajah she had been raised from, nearly as delicate as relations with the hall. Egwene made herself smile and bow her head graciously. If she gritted her teeth behind that smile, well, that helped keep her mouth shut. Not all of the sisters seemed aware of her presence. Karen, slender in plain brown wool and a cloak with surprisingly elaborate green embroidery, was staring at nothing, nodding to herself now and then. Apparently she was practicing what she would say inside. Karen was not strong in the power, little more than Siuan, if at all, but only one other of the 6, Thurva, a slim woman in yellow-slashed riding skirts and a cloak edged with yellow, stood even as high as she. That was a distressing measure of just how frightened the sisters were by that strange beacon of Saidar. The strongest should have stepped forward for the task that had been given to these, but except for Karen herself, zeal had been notably lacking. Her companions still appeared less than enthusiastic. Shanna normally maintained a deep reserve, despite eyes that made her appear constantly startled, but now they seemed ready to come out of her head with worry. She peered at the entrance to the hall, closed off by heavy flaps, and her hands fiddled with her cloak as if she could not keep them still. Raiko, a stout Arafellan blue, kept her eyes down, but the silver bells in her long dark hair chimed faintly, as if she were shaking her head inside her cowl. Only Thurva's long-nosed face wore a look of absolute serenity, completely unperturbed and unshakable, yet that in itself was a bad sign. The yellow sister was excitable by nature. What had they seen? What were Moria and the other 2 sitters after? Egwene controlled her impatience. The hall plainly was not sitting yet. It was gathering, but several sitters strolled past her and into the big pavilion, none hurrying. Salita hesitated as if she might speak, but then only dipped her knees before raising her yellow-fringed shawl onto her shoulders and sweeping inside. Quamesa peered down her sharp nose at Egwene while making her curtsy, and peered down her nose while studying Anaya and the others briefly. But then the slim gray peered down her nose at everyone. She was not tall, but she tried to seem so. Varana, face a mask of haughtiness and big brown eyes as cold as the snow, paused to offer cool courtesies to Egwene and frown at Karen. After a long moment, perhaps realizing that Karen did not even see her, she smoothed her silver-embroidered white skirts, which did not need it, adjusted her shawl along her arm so the white fringe hung just so, and glided through the entry flaps as though she just happened to be going in that direction. All 3 were among the sitters Siuan had pointed out as too young, as were Malind and Esmeralda. But Moria had been Aes Sedai for 130 years. Light. Siuan had her looking for conspiracies in everything. Just as Egwene began to think that her head would explode from frustration, if not from her headache, Shiriam suddenly appeared, hiking her cloak and skirts while half running across the dirty slush of the street. "I'm terribly sorry, Mother," she said breathlessly, channeling hurriedly to clean off the mud she had splashed on herself. It fell to the walkway in a dry powder when she twitched her skirts. I heard that the hall was sitting, and I knew you would be looking for me, so I came as fast as I could. I'm very sorry." So Siuan was still searching for her. "You're here now," Egwene said firmly. The woman must have been truly upset to offer apologies in front of the others, Karen and her companions more than Anaya and the rest. Even when people knew better, they tended to take you for what you appeared to be, and the keeper should not be seen apologizing and wringing her hands. Surely she knew that. Go ahead and announce me. Drawing a deep breath, Shiriam pushed back the hood of her cloak, adjusted her narrow blue stole, and stepped through the entry flaps. Her voice rang out clearly in the ritual phrases. She comes! She comes! Egwene barely waited for her to finish with, the flame of Tar Valon, the Amerlin seat, before striding in through the ring of braziers and stand lamps that rimmed the pavilion's walls. The stand lamps gave a good light, and the braziers, giving off a scent of lavender today, warmed the whole space. No one wished to have to ignore the cold when she could feel real warmth. The arrangement of the pavilion followed ancient rules, modified only slightly to allow for the fact that they were not meeting in the White Tower, in the great circular chamber called the Hall of the Tower. At the far end, a simple if well-polished bench stood atop a box-like platform covered with cloth striped in the 7 colors of the Ajahs. That and the stole around Egwene's neck were surely the only places in the camp where the red Ajah had any representation. Some blues had wanted the color removed, since Elida apparently had had the actual throne called the Amerlin seat repainted, and a stole woven without blue. But Egwene had dug in her heels. If she was to be of all Ajahs and none, then she would be of all Ajahs. Down the bright layered carpets that served as a ground cloth, 2 lines of benches slanted away from the entrance in groups of 3, sitting atop cloth-covered boxes in the colors of the Ajahs. Well, 6 of the Ajahs. By tradition, the 2 oldest sitters could claim the places closest to the Amerlin seat for their Ajahs, so yellow and blue held those spots here. After that, it was a matter of who came first and wished to be seated where, the first arrival always choosing her Ajah's place. There were only 9 sitters present, too few for the hall to be sitting yet, legally speaking, but an oddity in the seating struck Egwene right away. Unsurprisingly, Romanda was already in place, an empty bench between her and Salita, and Lilane and Moria occupied the end benches of the blue. Romanda, her hair in a tight gray bun on the nape of her neck, was the oldest sitter, and almost always the first to reach her place when the hall sat. Lilane, next oldest despite her dark glossy hair, seemed unable to let the other woman gain a jump on her, even in something so small. The men who had shifted the boxes, they were stored along the walls until the hall was called to sit, must have just left through the back, because Kwamesa, already seated on her bench, was the only gray sitter in evidence, and Barana, just climbing to hers, the only white. But Malind, a round-faced Kandori with an eagle's eyes and the lone green, obviously had entered ahead of them, yet, strangely, she had chosen to seat the greens near the pavilion's entrance. The nearer the Amerlin seat, the better was the usual thing. And directly opposite her, Esmeralda stood in front of the brown-covered boxes in hushed argument with Takima. Almost as short as Nisao, Takima was a quiet, bird-like woman, but she could be forceful when she wished, and with her fists on her hips she looked like a sparrow in a temper, feathers all puffed out to make her seem larger. By the way she kept darting sharp looks toward Barana, the seating was what upset her. It was too late for anything to be changed for this sitting, of course, but in any case, Esmeralda loomed back at Takima as if she expected to have to fight for her choice. It amazed Egwene how Esmeralda could do that. Loom, that was. She stood inches shorter even than Nisao. It must have been sheer force of will. Esmeralda never backed down when she thought she was in the right, and she always did think she was in the right. If Moria really did want an immediate assault on Tar Valon, and Malind really wanted to retreat, what did Esmeralda want? For all Suan's talk of sitters wanting to be warned, Egwene's entrance caused no great stir. For whatever reasons Malind and the others had called the hall to hear Karen's report, They had not considered the matter so sensitive that it needed to be held for sitters' ears alone, so little clusters of 4 or 5 Aes Sedai were standing behind the benches of their Ajah's sitters, and they made their curtsies as Egwene walked down the carpets toward her own seat. The sitters themselves merely watched her, or perhaps inclined a head briefly. Lelaine eyed her coolly, then returned to frowning faintly at Moria, a quite ordinary-appearing woman in plain blue wool. So ordinary, in fact, that you could miss the ageless quality in her face at first glance. She sat staring straight ahead, absorbed in her own thoughts. Ramonda was one of those to tilt her head a fraction. Inside the hall, the Amelin seat was still the Amelin seat, but a little less so than outside it. Inside the hall, sitters felt their power. In a way, the Amelin could be said to be only the first among equals inside the hall. Well, perhaps a little more than that, but not by much. Suan said as many Amelins had failed by believing the sitters were fully her equals, as by believing the difference was wider than really existed. It was like running along the top of a narrow wall with fierce mastiffs on either side. You maintained a careful balance and tried to watch your feet more than the dogs, but you were always aware of the dogs. Unpinning her cloak as she stepped up onto the striped box, Egwene folded it across her bench before sitting. The benches were hard, and some sitters brought cushions when they thought the sitting would be long. Egwene preferred not to. The prohibition on speeches seldom stopped at least 1 or 2 women from drawing their comments out at length, and a hard seat could help you remain awake through the worst. Shiriam took the keeper's place, standing to Egwene's left, and there was nothing to do but wait. Maybe she should have brought a cushion. The other benches were beginning to fill, though slowly. Aledrin and Saroya had joined Barana, Aledrin plump enough to make the other 2 appear slim. Of course, the vertical lines of white scroll work running down Saroya's skirts had that effect anyway, while Aledrin's wide white sleeves and the snowy panel running down the front of her dress did just the opposite. Each apparently was trying to find out whether the others knew what was afoot, from the way they were shaking their heads at each other and shooting glances toward the blues, the browns, and the greens. Varylin, a red-haired stork of a woman and taller than most men, had taken her seat beside Quamesa, too. Adjusting and readjusting her shawl restlessly, Varylin darted her eyes from Moria to Esmeralda to Malind and back. Magla, yellow-fringed shawl wrapped tightly around her broad shoulders, and Faisella, a square-faced Domani in silks covered with dense green embroidery, were just entering the pavilion, each ignoring the other, even when their skirts brushed. Magla was firmly in Ramonda's camp, and Faisella in Lelaine's, and the 2 groups did not mix. Other sisters were trickling in by spurts as well, Nisao and Mirel among 6 or so who slipped in behind Magla and Faisella. Morvrin was already among the browns behind Takima and Esmeralda, and Bayanin stood on the edge of the greys behind Varylin and Quamesa. At this rate, half the Aes Sedai in the camp would be crowded into the pavilion before long. While Magla was still walking down the carpets toward the yellow seats, Ramonda rose to her feet. "We are more than 11 now, so we may as well begin." Her voice was surprisingly high-pitched. You might have thought she had a beautiful singing voice, if you could imagine Ramonda singing. Her face always seemed more set for scolding, at least slightly disapproving. "I don't think we need make this a formal session," she added when Quamesa stood. "I hardly see why this need be done in session at all, but if it must, let us get it over and out of the way. Some of us have more important matters to deal with, as I'm sure you do, Mother." That last was said with a deep bow of her head, in a tone perhaps a hair too respectful. Not far enough over the line to be called sarcasm, of course. She was too intelligent to place herself in jeopardy. Fools seldom attained a sitter's chair, or held it long, and Ramonda had held a seat in the hall for almost 80 years. This was her 2nd time as a sitter. Egwene inclined her own head slightly, eyes cool, an acknowledgement that she had been addressed, and that she had marked the tone. A very careful balance. Quamesa was left looking around with her mouth open, uncertain whether she was to speak the phrases, always uttered by the youngest sitter present, that opened a formal sitting of the hall. Ramonda's place gave her considerable influence and some measure of authority, yet others could override her in this. A number of sitters frowned or shifted on their benches, but no one spoke. Lirella glided into the pavilion, glided toward the blue benches. Tall for a Kyrianan woman, which made her of average height for almost anywhere else, she was elegant in blue-slashed silk embroidered on the bodice with red and gold, her movements flowing. Some said she had been a dancer before coming to the tower as a novice. By comparison, Summerlin, the fox-faced green who entered on her heels, seemed to stride mannishly, though there was nothing at all awkward about the Mirambian woman. They both seemed surprised to see Quamesa on her feet, and hurried to their respective benches. In any case, Varelin began plucking at Quamesa's sleeve until the Arafellan woman finally sat down. Quamesa's face was a mask of cool calmness, yet she managed to radiate displeasure. She put a great store in ceremony. "Perhaps there is reason for formal session." Lilaine's voice seemed low after Ramonda's. Arranging her shawl as though she had all the time in the world, she rose gracefully, very deliberately not looking at Egwene. A beautiful woman, Lilaine still was dignity incarnate. "It seems that talks with Elida have been licensed," she said coolly. "I do understand that under the law of war we need not be consulted on this, but I also believe we should discuss it in session, especially since many of us face the possibility of being stilled if Elida retains any power." That word, stilled, no longer carried quite the chill it had before Suan and Lyanna were healed from stilling, but murmurs rose among the watching Aes Sedai crowded behind the benches. It seemed that news of negotiations had not spread as quickly as Egwene expected. She could not tell whether the sisters were excited or dismayed, but clearly they were surprised, including some of the sitters. Janya, who had entered while Lilane was speaking, stopped dead in her tracks, so that another knot of sisters coming in nearly walked into her. She stared at the blue, then longer and harder at Egwene herself. Ramonda plainly had not heard either from the way her mouth hardened, and expressions among the two young sitters ranged from Barana's icy calm to amazed on Samalin's part and openly appalled on Salita's. For that matter, Shiriam swayed on her feet for a moment. Egwene hoped the woman would not sick up in front of the entire hall. More interesting, though, were the reactions of those Delana had reported as speaking of negotiation. Carolyn sat very still and seemed to be suppressing a smile as she studied her skirts. But Magla licked her lips hesitantly and cast glances at Ramonda from the corner of her eye. Soroya had her eyes closed, and her mouth moved as though she might be uttering a prayer. Faisella and Takima gazed at Egwene, wearing almost identical tiny frowns. Then each noticed the other and gave a start, quickly assuming such regal serenity that they seemed to be mocking one another. It was very strange. Surely by now Baonin had informed all of them what Egwene had said, yet except for Varelin they seemed upset. They could not possibly have thought they might really negotiate an end. Every woman sitting in this hall risked stilling and execution just by being there. If there ever had been any path back except to remove Elida, it had washed away months ago when this hall was chosen. There was no going back from that. Lilane appeared satisfied with the reactions to her words. Smug as a cat in the milk barn, in fact. But before she finished settling back onto her bench, Moria bounded to her feet. That caught every eye and caused a few more murmurs. No one called Moria particularly graceful, but the Ilianer was not a woman who bounded. "That do need discussion," she said, "but it must come later. This hall did be called by 3 sitters, asking the same question. That question must be addressed before any other. What did Akaran and her party find? I do ask they be brought in to make their report before the hall." Lelaine scowled at her fellow blue, and she could scowl with the best, her eyes as sharp as awls, yet Tower law was quite plain on the subject for once, and well known to everyone. Often enough it was neither. In an unsteady voice, Sheriam asked Eledrin, the youngest after Quamesa, to go and escort Karen and the others before the hall. Egwene decided she had best talk to the fire-haired woman as soon as this sitting was done. If Sheriam kept on this way, she would soon become worse than useless as keeper. Delana darted into the pavilion amid a cluster of sisters, the last sitter to arrive, and was on her bench, draping her shawl across her elbows, by the time the plump white sitter returned with the 6 sisters and led them to stand before Egwene. They must have left their cloaks on the walkway outside, because none was wearing one now. Delana peered at them, an uncertain frown drawing her eyebrows down. She seemed out of breath, as though she had run to get there. Apparently, Eledrin felt that whether or not the sitting was formal, she, at least, should carry on with proper formality. "You have been called before the hall of the tower to relate what you have seen," she said in a strong Tarabona accent. Her combination of dark golden hair and brown eyes was not unusual in Tarabon, though she wore her shoulder-length hair caught in a lacy white net, rather than in beaded braids. "I charge you to speak of these things without the evasion or holding back, and to answer all questions in complete fullness, leaving out nothing. Say now that you will do so, under the light and by your hope of the rebirth and salvation, or suffer the consequences." Those ancient sisters who made this part of the hall's ceremony had been well aware of how much leeway the 3 oaths gave. A little left out here, a touch of vagueness there, and the whole meaning of what you said could be stood on its head. All the while you spoke only the truth. Karen spoke the assurance loudly and somewhat impatiently, the other 5 with varying levels of formality and self-consciousness. Many sisters had lived their entire lives without being called to testify in front of the hall. Eledrin waited until the last had repeated every word before marching back toward her bench. "Tell us what you did see, Karen," Moria said, as soon as the white sitter turned away. Eledrin stiffened visibly, and when she took her seat, her face was utterly expressionless, but bright spots of color highlighted her cheeks. Moria should have waited. She must have been very anxious. By tradition, there were many more traditions and customs than laws, and the Light knew there were more laws than anyone really knew, often contradictory layers of law laid down over the centuries, but tradition and custom ruled Aes Sedai as much as Tower law ever had, perhaps more so. By tradition, Karen addressed her response to the Amelin seat. "What we saw, Mother, was a roughly circular hole in the ground," she said, nodding for emphasis at nearly every other word. She seemed to choose those words carefully, as if to make sure she was absolutely clear to everyone. "It may have been a precise circle originally, shaped like half of a ball, but the sides have collapsed in some places. The hole is approximately 3 miles across and perhaps 1.5 miles deep." Someone gasped loudly, and Karen frowned as though whoever it was had tried to interrupt. She went on without pausing, however. "We could not be entirely certain of the depth. The bottom is covered with water and ice. We believe it may become a lake eventually. In any event, we were able to ascertain our exact location without too much difficulty, and we are prepared to say that the hole is located where the city called Shadar Logoth once stood." She fell silent, and for a long moment the only sound was the rustle of skirts as Aes Sedai shifted uneasily. Egwene wanted to shift too. Light. A hole that size would cover half of Tar Valon. "Do you have any idea how this hole was created, Karen?" she asked finally. She was quite proud of how steady her voice was. Sheriam was actually trembling. Egwene hoped no one else noticed. A keeper's actions always reflected on the Amelin. If the keeper showed fear, a good many sisters would think that Egwene was afraid. That was hardly something she wanted anyone to suspect. Each of us was chosen because we have some ability at reading residues, Mother. Better than most, in truth. So they had not been chosen simply because no one stronger was interested. There was a lesson in that. What Aes Sedai did was seldom as simple as it appeared on the surface. Egwene wished she could stop having to relearn lessons she had thought already learned. Nisain is the best of us at that, Akaran went on. With your permission, Mother, I will let her answer. Nisain smoothed her dark woolen skirts nervously and cleared her throat. A gangly gray with a strong chin and startlingly blue eyes, she had some small repute in matters of law and treaties, but she was obviously uneasy about speaking before the hall. She looked straight at Egwene with the air of someone who did not want to actually see all the sitters assembled. Given the amount of cider used there, Mother, it was no surprise to find the residues near with snow. More than a hint of Murandy clung to her tongue, a lilting sound. Even after so long, I should have been able to grasp some idea of what was woven, if it was at all like anything I'm familiar with, but I have none. I could all but trace the weaving, and it made no sense at all. None. In fact, it seemed so alien it might not have been... Clearing her throat again, she swallowed. Her face grew a little paler. It might not have been woven by a woman. We thought it must have been the Forsaken, of course, so I tested for resonance. We all did. Half turning to gesture to her companions, she hurriedly turned back. She definitely preferred looking at Egwene to the sitters, all leaning forward intently. I can't say what was done beyond scooping 3 miles out of the earth, or how it was done, but Saidin was definitely used too. The resonance was so strong we should have been able to smell it. There was more Saidin used than Saidar, much more. Dragon Mount beside a foothill, and that is all I can say, Mother. A sound fluttered through the pavilion, the sound of sisters letting out the breath they had been holding. Shiriam's exhalation seemed the loudest, but perhaps that was just because she was nearest. Egwene schooled her face to stillness. The Forsaken, and a weave that could tear away half of Tarvalon. If Malind did propose flight, could she try to make the sisters remain and face that? Could she abandon Tarvalon and the tower and the light knew how many thousands of lives? Does anyone else have a question? She asked. I have one, Ramonda said in a dry tone. Her calm had not cracked by a hair. But not for these sisters. If no one has any further questions for them, I'm sure they would like to be away from having the hall stare at them. It was not precisely her place to suggest that, but neither was it precisely not, so Egwene let it pass. No one else had questions for Akaran or her companions, as it turned out, and Ramonda offered them surprisingly warm thanks for their efforts. Again, not precisely her place. Who is your question for? Egwene asked, as Akaran and the other 5 scattered to join the growing numbers of sisters crowding among the stand lamps and braziers. They were eager, as Ramonda had said, to get out from under the hall's eyes. They did want to hear what came of their work. It was very difficult for Egwene to keep asperity out of her voice. Ramonda affected not to notice, or perhaps did not notice. For Moria, she said, we suspected the Forsaken from the start. We knew that whatever happened was powerful and far away. All we've learned, really, is that Shadar Logoth is gone, and of that I can only say the world is better off without that sinkhole of the shadow. She fixed the blue sitter with a frown that had made many an Aes Sedai squirm like a novice. My question is this. Has anything changed for us? It should, Moria replied, meeting the other woman's stare levelly. She might not have been in the hall as long as Ramonda, but sitters were at least supposedly on an equal footing. We have long had preparations in case the Forsaken do come against us. Every sister does know to form a circle if she be able, or join one she does find forming until every circle does reach 13. Everyone is to be brought in, even the novices, even the newest. Lelaine looked up at her sharply, but however much she wanted to chide Moria, they were of the same Aja. They must give at least the appearance of a common front. The effort of keeping her mouth shut thinned Lelaine's lips, though. Ramonda was under no such constraint. Must you explain what everyone here already knows? We are the ones who made those arrangements. Perhaps you have forgotten? This time her voice was cutting. Open displays of anger were forbidden in the hall, but not goading. If Moria felt the prick, though, she gave no outward sign beyond adjusting her shawl. I must explain from the beginning, because we have no thought far enough. Malend, can our circles stand against what Akaran and Nisain described? Despite her fierce eyes, Malend's full mouth always looked ready to smile, but she was quite stern as she stood, and she stared at each sitter in turn as if to impress her words on them. They cannot. Even if we rearrange matters so the strongest sisters are always in the same circle, and that means they must live, eat, and sleep together if they're to link on the moment. Even then, we would be mice facing a cat. Enough mice can overwhelm even a large, hungry cat, but not before many mice are dead. If enough of these mice die, though, the White Tower dies. Again that ripple of sighs ran through the pavilion like an unsteady breeze. Egwene managed to keep her face calm, but she had to force her fists to relax their grip on her skirt. Which would they propose, an assault or flight? Flight. How could she oppose them? Same Aja or not, Lelaine could take the strain no longer. What are you suggesting, Moria? She snapped. Even if we reunite the tower this very day, that won't change the facts. Moria smiled slightly, as if the other blue had said just what she was hoping someone would say. But we must change the facts. The fact at present do be that our strongest circles be two. We do have no Angreal, much less Angreal, so we might as well ignore them. I'm no certain there be anything even in the tower that would make a large enough difference anyway. How then do we make our circles stronger? Strong enough, we must hope, to face what happened at Shadar Logoth and stop it. Esmeralda, what have you to say on the matter? Startled, Egwene leaned forward. They were working together, but to what end? She was not the only one to realize that the three sitters who had called the hall were all on their feet. By remaining standing, Moria and Malend had made a clear declaration. Esmeralda stood like a queen, yet the tiny brown seemed all too aware of the eyes sliding between her and Malend and Moria, the thoughtful frowns and two still faces. She shifted her shawl twice before speaking. She sounded as though she were lecturing a class, her voice thin yet forceful. The ancient literature is quite clear, though little studied, I fear. It gathers dust rather than readers. Writings collected in the earliest years of the tower make it plain that circles were not limited to 13 in the Age of Legends. The precise mechanism, I should say the precise balance, is unknown, but it should not be too difficult to work out. For those of you who have not spent the time you should have in the tower library, the manner of increasing the size of a circle involves... For the first time, she faltered and visibly forced herself to continue. Involves the inclusion of men who can channel. Faisella popped to her feet. What are you suggesting? She demanded, and sat down immediately as though someone might think she was standing in support. I do ask that the hall be cleared, Magla said, rising. Like Moria, she was Ileana, and agitation thickened her accent markedly. This do no be a matter for discussion before any save the hall in closed sitting. She too dropped back onto her bench as soon as she finished and sat glowering, wide shoulders hunched, and hands opening and closing on her skirts. I do fear it be too late for that, Moria said loudly. She had to speak loudly to be heard over the murmur of sisters talking excitedly behind the benches, a hum like a huge beehive. What has been said, and heard by too many sisters for anyone to try shutting the words away now. Her bosom rose as she pulled in a deep breath, and she raised her voice a notch louder. I do put before the hall the proposal that we do enter into an agreement with the Black Tower that we may bring men into our circles at need. If she sounded a trifle strangled at the end, it was no wonder. Few Aes Sedai could say that name without emotion, disgust, if not outright hatred. It struck against the buzz of voices
I'm doing the season on it, so
I
work at a crusader.
That is madness! Shiriam's shriek shattered the stillness in more ways than one. The keeper did not enter discussions in the hall. She could not even enter the hall itself without the Amaryllis. Face flooding with red, Shiriam drew herself up, perhaps to face the inevitable rebuke, perhaps to defend herself. The hall had other things on its mind than rebuking her, though. Leaping up from their benches just long enough to get their words out, sitters began to speak, to shout, sometimes on top of one another. Madness hardly begins to describe it, Faisella shouted, at the same time that Varilyn cried, How can we ally ourselves with men who can channel? These so-called Ashaman are tainted, Saroya called out, with no sign of the vaunted white Aja reserve. Hands knotted in her shawl, she trembled so hard the long, snowy fringe swayed.
Oh, yeah.
Tainted with the Dark One's touch.
You could pick different
Even suggesting such a thing puts us against all the White Tower stands for, Takima said roughly. We would be despised by every woman who calls herself Aes Sedai. By Aes Sedai long in their graves.
I'm working on.
Magla went so far as to shake it.
For the season, I'm working on 3 different ones.
To mask. Only a dark friend could suggest this. Only a dark friend.
A barbarian
paled at the accusation, then went bright red with anger of her own. Egwene did not know where she stood on this. The Black Tower was Rand's creation, and perhaps necessary if there was to be any hope of winning the last battle. Yet the Ashaman were men who could channel, a thing feared for 3,000 years, and they channeled shadow-stained Saidin. Rand himself was a man who could channel, yet without him, the shadow would win a Tarmangaiden. The light helper for seeing it so coldly, but it was hard. Wherever she stood on the matters were getting out of hand there and then. Esmeralda was exchanging insults with Faisella, both at the tops of their lungs. Open insults in the hall. Saroya had abandoned the last shreds of white Aja coolness and was screaming at Malind, who screamed back, neither waiting on the other. It would have been a wonder if either could understand what the other was saying, and perhaps a blessing if they could not.
But what's cool is
surprisingly,
the barbarian,
neither Ramonda nor Lavaine had opened her mouth
with
since
the right
the beginning.
armor, with the right
They
gear,
sat staring at one
weapons
another,
and whatnot.
unblinking.
You
Likely
could,
each was trying to read how the other
make
would
it to where
stand, just so
you could
she could
stand in the
stand
middle of
in
one of the
opposition.
enemies.
Magla
bang the
got down
shit out
from her
of them
bench and stalked toward
in your
Moria
life
with the glare
for-
of someone eager to come to blows. Not words, but fists. Magla's were
Pretty much,
clenched at her sides.
Won't go
Her
down, your
fine
life bar
work
be like
shawl
this.
slid off onto the carpets unnoticed. Standing, Egwene embraced the source. Except for certain exactly prescribed functions,
what's good about
channeling was
Crusader.
forbidden in the hall. Another of the customs that pointed to darker days in the hall's history. But she made a simple weave of air and
The
fire.
barbarians are just
A
tanks.
proposal has been laid before the hall, she said, and released Saidar. That was not as hard as it once had been. Not easy, not close to easy, not as hard. A memory of the power's sweetness remained, enough to sustain her until the next time. Magnified by the weave, her words boomed in the pavilion like thunder. Aes Sedai shrank back, wincing and covering their ears. The silence after seemed incredibly loud. Magla gaped at her in astonishment, then gave a start at realizing that she was standing halfway to the blue benches. Hastily unloosing her fists, she paused to snatch up her shawl and hurried back to her own seat. Shiriam stood weeping openly. Surely it had not been that loud. A proposal has been laid before the hall, Egwene repeated into the phone. After that power-magnified glare, her voice rang in her ears. Perhaps it had been louder than she thought. That weave had never been intended for use inside walls, even patched canvas walls. How speak you in support of an alliance with the Black Tower, Moria? She sat down as soon as she finished. How did she stand on this? What difficulties would it present her? How could it be used to advantage? The light help her indeed. Those were the first two things to come to mind. She wished Shiriam would dry her eyes and straighten her backbone. She was the Amelin seat, and she needed a keeper, not a milksop. It took a few minutes for order to restore itself. Sitters straightening clothes and smoothing skirts unnecessarily, avoiding each other's eyes and especially not looking at the watching sisters crowded behind the benches. Some sitters' faces became stained with red that had nothing to do with anger. Sitters did not shriek at one another like farmhands at shearing, most especially not in front of other sisters. We do be faced with two seemingly insurmountable difficulties, Moria said finally. Her voice was composed and cool once more, but a hint of flush still hung in her cheeks. The Forsaken have discovered a weapon, discovered or uncovered. They surely would have used it before now had they possessed it. A weapon we can no counter, a weapon we can no match, though the light do know why we would wish to, but most importantly, a weapon we can neither survive nor stop. At the same time, the Ashaman have grown like weeds. Reliable reports do put their numbers at nearly equal to all the Aes Sedai living. Even if that number do be inflated, we can no afford to believe it exaggerated far, and more men come every day. The Eisendeers do be too consistent to believe anything else. We should take these men and gentle them, of course, but we have ignored them because of the Dragon Reborn. We have put them off to be dealt with later. The bitter truth do be that it be too late to try taking them. They do be too many. Maybe it did be too late when we did first learn what they were doing. If we can no gentle these men, then we must control them somehow. An agreement with the Black Tower. Alliance be too strong a word. With a carefully worded agreement, we can take the first steps toward protecting the world from them. We also can bring them into our circles. Raising a cautionary finger, Moria ran her gaze along the benches, but her voice remained cool and composed and firm. We must make it clear that a sister will always meld the flows. I do not suggest letting a man control a linked circle, but with men in the circles we can expand them. With the blessings of the light, perhaps we can expand the circles far enough to counter this weapon of the Forsaken. We do kill two hares with one stone, but these hares do be lions, and if we do no cast that stone, one of them will surely kill us. It is as simple as that. Silence fell, excepting Shiriam at least. Standing hunched in on herself a few feet from Egwene, shoulders shaking, she still had not mastered her weapon. Then Ramonda sighed heavily. Perhaps we can expand the circles enough to counter the Forsaken, she said in a quiet voice, in a way that gave her words more weight than if she had shouted. Perhaps we can control the Ashaman. A thin word, perhaps, in either context. When you do be drowning, Moria replied, equally quiet. You do grab at whatever branch floats by, even when you can no be sure it will support your weight until you have hold. The water has no closed over our heads yet, Ramonda, but we be drowning. We do be drowning. Again there was silence, but for Shiriam's sniveling. Had she forgotten all self-control? But then no one among the sitters wore a pleasant expression, not even Moria or Malind or Esmeralda. It was not a pleasant prospect that lay in front of them. Delana's face had turned decidedly red. She looked as if she might be the one to sick up, rather than Shiriam. Egwene stood once more, long enough to ask the required question. Even when the unthinkable was proposed, the rituals must be followed, perhaps more so then than ever. Who speaks against this proposal? There was no shortage of speakers there, though everyone had regained herself enough for them to follow protocol. Several sitters moved at once, but Magla was first on her feet, and the others sat back with no outward displays of impatience. Faisella followed Magla, and Barrelin followed Faisella. Then came Soroya, and finally Takima. Each spoke at length, Barrelin and Soroya coming very near making the forbidden speeches, and each spoke with all the eloquence she could summon. No one reached a sitter's chair lacking eloquence at need. Even so, it soon became clear that they were repeating themselves and each other, just in different words. The Forsaken and their weapon were never mentioned. The Black Tower was the sitter's topic, the Black Tower and the Ashaman. The Black Tower was a blight on the face of the earth, as great a threat to the world as the last battle itself. The very name suggested connections to the shadow, not to mention being a direct slap of the White Tower. The so-called Ashaman, no one used the name without adding so-called or saying it with a sneer. Guardians it meant in the old tongue, and they were anything but guardians. The so-called Ashaman were men who could channel, men doomed to go insane if the male half of the power did not kill them first, madmen wielding the one power. From Magla to Takima, every one of them invested that with every scrap of horror in them. 3,000 years of the world's horror, and the breaking of the world before that. Men like this had destroyed the world, destroyed the age of legends, and changed the face of the world to desolation. This was who they were being asked to make alliance with. If they did so, they would be anathema in every nation, and rightly. They would be scorned by every Aes Sedai, and rightly. It could not be. It could not. When Takima finally sat, arranging her shawl carefully along her arms, she wore a small but quite satisfied smile. Together they had managed to make the Ashaman seem more fearsome, more dangerous than the Forsaken and the last battle combined, maybe even a match for the Dark One himself. Since Egwene had begun the ritual questions, it was for her to finish, and she rose long enough to say, "Who stands for an agreement with the Black Tower?" She had only thought there was silence in the pavilion before. Shiriam had finally governed her weeping, though tears glistened on her cheeks still, but her gulp sounded like shouts in the quiet that followed that question. Takima's smile slid sideways when Janya stood as soon as the question left Egwene's mouth. "Even a slim branch is better than no branch when you're drowning," Janya said. "I'd rather try than trust to hope until I go under." She had the habit of speaking when she was not supposed to. Sonalyn rose to stand beside Mo. Chapter 20.
All right, everyone. I'm going to call it into the stream for tonight. I want to thank everyone stopping by and everyone who keeps stopping by. I appreciate all y'all support. Till next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe.